The first shot split the air before anyone realized she had moved. 1 second, Mara Voss was crouched over a bleeding man on a concrete floor, both hands pressing gauze into a wound that wouldn't stop. The next, she had drawn her sidearm, pivoted on one knee, and put a round through the shoulder of a gunman emerging from the stairwell, all without letting go of her patient with her left hand. The operators who had spent 3 weeks calling her the babysitter stood frozen in the lobby doorway. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A decorated sergeant with 14 years of combat tours behind him looked at the woman in scrubs and body armor, still applying pressure to the wound, weapon already back in its holster, and said the only thing that came to him. What in the hell? They had laughed when she first walked onto the base. They had made jokes about her med bag, her size, her soft voice, the way she wrote things down in her notebook during tactical briefings, as if she were attending a conference instead of preparing for a combat integration assignment. They had tested her, dismissed her, and when that didn't work, they had tried to have her removed. They should have asked more questions before they started laughing. If this story already has you at the edge of your seat, stay with me until the very last second. Subscribe so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. Hit like if you want justice for Mara, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive into Callaway, Nevada, took Mara Voss 4.5 hours from the airport, through a stretch of high desert that offered nothing but pale rock, heat shimmer, and the occasional billboard advertising a casino she had no intention of visiting. She had a duffel bag in the back seat, a thermos of black coffee going cold in the cup holder, and a transfer order on the passenger seat that she had already memorized and didn't need to look at again. Hargrove Veterans Combat Medical Center, Special Operations Medical Integration Program, Cohort 7, reporting date 0600. She arrived at 0545. The base checkpoint guard was young, maybe 22, with the particular expression of someone who had been awake since 3 in the morning and developed a specific contempt for everyone he encountered as a result. He looked at her credentials, looked at her, looked at the credentials again. His partner in the booth leaned forward slightly to get a better look. "Nurse?" the guard said. "Combat Medical Specialist," Mara said, "assigned to the SOMIP unit. The paperwork's right there." He processed it without further commentary, but she caught the look he exchanged with his partner. A small, sideways glance that communicated exactly what he thought about a woman in a civilian jacket arriving at a special operations integration compound before dawn with a single bag and a coffee thermos. She had been catching that look for most of her career. She had stopped letting it bother her around year 3. Now it was just data. Information about what she was walking into and what she would have to navigate. She parked where the guard directed her, picked up her bag, and walked toward the administrative building without looking back. The morning air was cold and carried the smell of diesel and dry earth. Somewhere across the compound, she could hear the rhythmic thud of a helicopter warming up for an early sortie. 2 men in full kit jogged past her without acknowledging her existence. A third, coming the other direction, slowed just enough to look her over with undisguised skepticism before continuing on his way. She kept walking. The admin sergeant who processed her paperwork was a heavy-set woman named DeLuca, who had the professional warmth of someone who had processed 1,000 new arrivals and found exactly none of them interesting. She stamped Mara's orders, assigned her a badge and a bunk in the medical staff quarters, and slid a program schedule across the desk with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on institutional autopilot. "First integration brief is at 700, DeLuca said. "Building C. Try not to be late. Colonel Hartwick doesn't do late." "Understood. You're the only nurse assigned to this cohort." Mara looked up from the badge lanyard she was examining. "Meaning?" DeLuca's expression didn't change. "Meaning the rest of the medical staff are combat surgeons and pararescue. You'll want to know that going in." It wasn't a warning, exactly. It was information delivered without apparent malice, which Mara appreciated more than she would have appreciated either warmth or hostility. Both of those would have meant someone was performing something. DeLuca was just doing her job. Mara thanked her, collected her badge, and found her quarters. The room was small and utilitarian. 2 bunks, a metal locker, a narrow window overlooking a gravel yard where someone had abandoned a folding chair. The other bunk was empty, recently vacated based on the faint impression in the mattress and a single bobby pin left on the shelf above it. Mara unpacked with the efficiency of someone who had lived out of a bag more often than not, changed into her uniform, and sat on the edge of her bunk for exactly 4 minutes before heading to Building C. She was the first one there. She took a seat in the second row, set her notebook on the desk in front of her, and waited. Colonel Diane Hartwick was not what Mara had expected, which she suspected was intentional. The colonel was compact, somewhere in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that came from decades of learning not to waste energy on performance. She stood at the front of the briefing room and watched the space fill without speaking, and the silence she generated was different from most people's silence. It had actual weight, the kind that made people stop fidgeting. The unit filed in over the next 10 minutes. 12 operators, 3 combat surgeons, 2 pararescue specialists, and a logistics officer who looked like he had somewhere better to be. They filled the rows with the casual physical confidence of people who had trained together long enough to stop consciously managing their bodies in shared space. Mara sat in the second row. She was the only woman in the room. She was also at least 8 years younger than the next youngest person visible, which she had factored into her read of the room before she'd even chosen her seat. A man in the row behind her leaned over to the man beside him and didn't bother to lower his voice enough. "Who's the girl?" "Nurse, assigned from the medical integration program." A pause that lasted about 2 seconds. "They sent us a nurse?" Low laughter, quickly suppressed when Hartwick's gaze moved across the room with the calm precision of a security camera completing a sweep. The laughter died as if someone had flipped a switch. The brief lasted 40 minutes. Hartwick outlined the integration program in precise, unornamented language. Cohort 7 would spend 8 weeks embedding military medical staff with active special operations units in a structured evaluation designed to improve cross-functional trauma response in field conditions. There would be drills, qualifications, field exercises, and a final integration assessment at the end of the program that would determine ongoing assignment eligibility. "This is not a courtesy program," Hartwick said. She said it without raising her voice, which made it land harder than if she had. "Everyone in this room is here because someone believed they belonged here. You will prove or disprove that belief through performance. Nothing else matters." She made no specific acknowledgement of Mara. No introduction, no singling out. Mara had specifically not asked for either. Being pointed at in a room full of people who were already looking for reasons to dismiss you was the last thing she needed in week 1. After the brief, the operators filtered out ahead of the medical staff. Mara was collecting her notebook when a tall, broad-shouldered man stopped beside her row. He was probably mid-30s, with the particular weathered look of someone who had spent years in places that were unkind to faces. He had sergeant's chevrons and the quiet self-possession of someone who had stopped needing to announce himself a long time ago. He was looking at her the way she had already been looked at 3 times that morning, like a logistical variable that hadn't been anticipated. "Voss?" he said. "That's me." Staff Sergeant Rourke, primary JTAC for Bravo Element. He extended a hand, which she shook. His grip was measured, but not crushing, but testing. She had encountered both types. She preferred the measured kind because it meant the person was actually gathering information rather than just asserting themselves. "You have field medicine experience?" "I do." "Combat?" "Some." He waited for her to expand on that. She didn't. His expression shifted, not hostile, but recalibrating. "The qualification drills start Thursday. Combat medicine rotations before that." He paused just a half-second longer than necessary. "You'll want to keep up." "I'll manage," Mara said. He held her gaze for a moment, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read, then nodded once and left without further comment. She recognized the exchange for what it was. Not a welcome, not an attack, but a test laid as casually as dropping a coin to see which way it fell. He'd wanted to know if she would bristle, over-explain, try to establish her credentials preemptively. She hadn't. She filed that information away and moved on. The combat medicine rotations were held in a converted hangar at the far end of the compound that smelled of rubber matting and industrial disinfectant. The space held mounted scenario stations, an equipment staging area, and a cadre of instructors who ran the sessions with the brisk, practiced efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the novelty was long gone. Mara had been through versions of these drills before. The formats varied, but the fundamentals didn't change. Tourniquet application under simulated stress, hemorrhage control in restricted positions, airway management with degraded resources, triage sequencing when casualties outnumbered responders by a factor that made clean decisions impossible. She knew the steps cold. More than that, she knew the places where people fell apart, the specific decision points where stress narrowed the thinking and people stopped seeing the patient and started reacting to the noise. What she had not fully anticipated was how the drills would be structured to make her visible. It wasn't anything overt. Nobody announced that the nurse was being tested differently, but she was consistently placed in the scenarios with the highest physical demand, carrying a 220-pound casualty dummy across a 40-meter stretch while simultaneously managing an airway, performing chest compressions in a confined crawl space with a ceiling that required her to work with bent elbows and compromised leverage, executing a field blood transfusion setup, while an instructor shouted simulated incoming fire into her left ear at close range, and another periodically grabbed her equipment and threw it out of reach to simulate a chaotic environment. The instructors weren't singling her out with malice, she thought. The program was designed to break people down to see what they were made of underneath, and she was an unknown quantity with a record that, for reasons she couldn't yet explain in this context, didn't look like what they expected. So they pushed where they could push. She didn't fail any of the drills. She didn't slow down, didn't ask for accommodation, didn't make a single comment about the disparity in how the scenarios were being weighted. She made one genuine error on the second day, missed a secondary bleed on a multi-trauma scenario casualty because she had correctly prioritized the arterial wound but failed to account for how the casualty's positioning was concealing the secondary site. She caught it in the review, named it clearly without hedging, and corrected the gap in her assessment process before the next run. The combat surgeon who led the rotations, a tall, precise man named Dr. Farley, who wore his authority lightly because he didn't need to wear it heavily, acknowledged her correction in the debrief the same way he acknowledged everyone's debrief, without praise, without criticism, with the even-handed attention of someone who was actually tracking the data rather than performing fairness. On the third day, during a break between scenarios, one of the operators, a compact, shaved-head specialist named Greer, who moved with the particular energy of someone who had never experienced meaningful self-doubt, leaned against the wall near her equipment station in the manner of someone about to offer a compliment they expected to be received as a gift. "You're not bad," he said, "for a clinic nurse." Mara looked at him without changing her expression. "I'm not a clinic nurse." "ER? Field." He looked mildly skeptical. "Where?" "Several places." "That's not really an answer." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "It's not." Greer stared at her for a moment, genuinely uncertain how to proceed with someone who declined to fill the silence the way most people felt obligated to, then shrugged with studied casualness and walked away. Mara went back to resetting her equipment for the next scenario. 2 hours later, during the afternoon break, she passed a corridor outside the hangar and heard two voices that didn't quite make it to a murmur. "Doesn't belong here. This is a waste of program slots." Hartwick assigned her. "Hartwick's trying to hit a diversity benchmark. Come on, you know how this works." "I don't know, man. She didn't fold on the multi-casualty drill, and Farley hasn't flagged her. That's basic nursing school material. Wait until Thursday when she's on the range. That's when we see what we're actually dealing with." She walked past the doorway without breaking stride. Neither man noticed her. She kept her face neutral and kept walking, filing the conversation away the same way she filed everything. Not as a wound, not as fuel for anger, but as information about the terrain she was moving through. Thursday was the firearm qualifications. She had known the conversation about Thursday was coming before she'd ever set foot on this compound. She had been waiting for it the way you waited for weather you could already smell on the wind. The qualification range at Hargrove was a long, covered structure with individual firing positions, target systems at variable distances, and a digital scoring setup that logged every round on a screen visible to everyone on the line. The program ran all personnel through the same course of fire, regardless of medical or operational role, a deliberate integration philosophy decision that Hartwick had outlined in a supplemental memo Mara had read twice on her second evening, sitting on her bunk with her coffee. She showed up Thursday morning in the same efficient state she showed up for everything. She checked in, drew her assigned equipment, and stood in her lane without announcement. The operators around her were relaxed in the way people were relaxed when they had been handling firearms long enough that it was simply a known variable. Running through their warm-up process, checking their setups, talking to each other in the clipped, shorthand way of people with shared context. A few of them glanced at her. Greer, 2 lanes to her right, made brief eye contact and looked away. She ran her own checks, settled her stance, and waited for the range officer's command. The first stage was controlled pairs at multiple distances with a time element. Mara brought her breathing down to a rate that had taken her a long time to train and worked through the stage the way she'd been taught. Economical movement, deliberate sight picture, no anticipation, no rush. The trigger broke cleanly each time. She was already indexing the next target before the previous round had finished its flight. The scores posted on the board behind the line. She had outperformed 9 of the 12 operators on stage 1. The range went quieter in a specific way. Not the silence of people being polite, but the silence of people revising something. She could feel the attention on her without looking to find it. The range master, a weathered warrant officer named Hennessy, who had the permanently squinted expression of a man who had spent 30 years looking downrange, glanced at the board, glanced at her, and said nothing. Stage 2 was considerably more demanding. Movement and target engagement, drawing from a retention holster, strong hand and support hand strings, an accelerated time element built to make people hurry. Hurrying on a qualification course was, Mara had come to understand years ago, a stress response. The body's answer to pressure was speed. Speed without control was just fast misses. The people who performed best under the time element weren't the ones who moved faster. They were the ones who had trained their nervous systems to stop treating the clock as a threat. She moved through the stage without hurry and without hesitation. Each position was clean. Each transition was deliberate. When the buzzer ended the stage, she stepped back off the line and cleared her weapon, and the score posted before she had finished her administrative reload. When Hennessy read the full qualification results at the end of the session, Mara ranked second overall. She had outscored every operator except Rourke, who had run a near-perfect course that she recognized as the product of exceptional natural ability combined with long familiarity with the specific layout and timing of that particular range. The silence that followed Hennessy's reading had a completely different quality from the silence that had been present at the start of the morning. This silence wasn't dismissal. This was the sound of people processing something that didn't fit the story they'd already written. Voss, she turned. Rourke was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the testing assessment of their first conversation, not skepticism, or even the recalibration she'd caught on the range during stage 1. This was something more fundamental, a question forming that he didn't quite know how to ask. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he said. "The same place I learned everything else," Mara said. "Which is?" She picked up her gear bag and slung it over one shoulder. "Thursday qualification's done," she said. "What's on the schedule for Friday?" She walked back toward the equipment staging area without waiting for an answer. Behind her, she heard Greer say something to the man beside him, his voice low but not low enough. What in the hell is she? It was the first time she had heard actual uncertainty in his voice. Not hostility, not contempt. Something closer to the beginning of a real question. She didn't let herself react to it, but she noted it the way she noted everything, and she kept walking. Chunk. What came next wasn't only a response to her qualification scores. She understood that later, when she had enough of the picture to see it clearly, it had been building before she arrived. The decision, or something like a decision, that she wasn't supposed to be here, and that what she had demonstrated on the range and in the rotations was less a point in her favor and more an irritant that needed to be managed. She discovered this on Monday of the second week, when a message was delivered to the support ward where she was reviewing case files between rotations, informing her that she was required in a meeting in Conference Room B at 1400. She arrived to find Colonel Hartwick, Dr. Farley, a major named Cass, who ran personnel assessment for the program, and a woman she didn't recognize sitting at the far end of the table. The woman was introduced as Lieutenant Colonel Serena Price, Program Oversight Representative from the Regional Command. Mara sat down and took the room's temperature in approximately 3 seconds. Hartwick was unreadable in the careful way of someone keeping themselves deliberately unreadable, which meant the situation was complicated enough that she didn't want her position visible yet. Farley was maintaining a neutrality that had a slight strain around the edges. Cass was uncomfortable in the way people were uncomfortable when they'd been placed in a position they hadn't fully agreed to. Price had the settled, collected bearing of someone who had already decided how this meeting ended. "We've received some concerns," Price said, "regarding your integration into the program." "What kind of concerns?" Mara asked. "Several unit members have raised issues relating to your background documentation. There are gaps in your service record that raise legitimate questions about your qualifications for this assignment." Mara looked at Hartwick. Hartwick looked back without expression. Mara looked back at Price. "My documentation was reviewed and approved by the program selection board before I was assigned," Mara said. "That review didn't include a full cross-check with the relevant medical licensing and service records archives." Price set a folder on the table with the deliberate care of someone placing evidence. "Additionally, there are concerns from unit members about professional compatibility. Multiple individuals have raised issues about your ability to integrate effectively with the team." "Multiple individuals," Mara said. "Which ones?" "The concerns were submitted confidentially, so I don't get to know who is saying what about me. These are professional compatibility concerns, not accusations. The program has an obligation to evaluate them regardless of source." Mara looked at the folder on the table but didn't reach for it. She recognized the architecture of what was in front of her. Not from this exact situation, but from the pattern underneath it. Anonymous concerns filed after a performance that made certain people uncomfortable. Documentation questions surfaced weeks into an assignment that had already passed a formal review. Vague language designed to be impossible to specifically refute. It was machinery. The specific pieces were different, but the machine was familiar. "What is the proposed next step?" she asked. "Your active participation in the integration program will be paused pending a documentation review. You'll be temporarily reassigned to the General Medical Support Ward while the procedural questions are resolved." Timeline? Reviews of this nature can be difficult to predict. Mara was still for a moment. "Colonel Hartwick," she said, "has there been a performance issue? Anything from the rotations or the qualification phase that didn't meet program standards?" Hartwick's expression shifted by a degree that most people wouldn't have caught. A slight tightening, quickly controlled. "Your performance has met all program benchmarks," the colonel said. Her voice was level and precise. "The questions being raised are procedural in nature." "Then I'll cooperate with whatever review process is required," Mara said. "I'd also like a written summary of the specific concerns being cited." Price's composure didn't crack, but something behind it moved. "Written summaries of confidential concerns are not standard procedure. If the concerns are driving a decision about my assignment, I'm entitled to understand what I'm responding to," Mara said. "I'm happy to submit a formal request through command channels if that's the more appropriate route." A silence that lasted 4 seconds and covered a significant amount of actual communication between the people in the room. "We'll review what documentation can be shared," Price said finally. "Thank you," Mara said. She was reassigned to the General Medical Support Ward that same afternoon. Someone had already arranged her transfer paperwork before the meeting ended, which told her the meeting had been less of a review and more of a notification. The general ward was quieter than the integration compound. Longer shifts, more predictable rhythms, staffed by people who had no context for what had happened and no particular interest in asking. She worked her hours, maintained her standards, and said nothing about her situation to anyone who hadn't already been informed. On her second evening, Rourke appeared in the staff break room. She looked up from the report she was reviewing when he came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone arriving somewhere they weren't sure they should be, then came in and took the chair across from her. He wasn't in uniform, off-shift clothes, jacket, the look of someone who had made a specific decision to come here rather than simply ending up here. "I heard what happened," he said. "Okay," she said. "The documentation concerns. It's a pretext." He said it flatly, not as an accusation of anyone in particular, just as an assessment. Greer went to Price the day after the qualification results posted. Him and 2 others from the unit. "I wasn't part of it and I didn't know it was happening." "But you know now." "I know now." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not here in any official capacity. I want to be clear about that." "Why are you here at all?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again there was something honest in the bluntness of it. "Because you outscored me on stage 2 by 2 points," he said. I've been running that course for 3 years. Nobody who scores like that has meaningful gaps in their training record. The documentation issue doesn't add up. No, she said, it doesn't. What's actually in your file? She met his gaze steadily. Information I'm not authorized to share in this context. He sat with that for a long moment. Restricted background, he said. Not quite a question. She neither confirmed nor denied it. She didn't need to. Rourke was intelligent enough that he was already drawing his own conclusions, and they were the right ones. He stood, straightened his jacket. The integration assessment is in 6 days. Whatever procedural hold they've put on your status, the assessment will still run on schedule. He paused in the doorway. I can't promise anything, but I can tell you that if you're cleared to participate, you'll be evaluated on what you can actually do. That's all I've ever asked for, Mara said. He nodded once and left. She sat alone for a while after that, her coffee cooling on the table in front of her, thinking about what was in her file and what it would mean when an authorized review finally accessed it. Because she had known, from the moment Price set that folder on the table, that someone above Price's level was going to end up making a call, and when that call was made, the documentation questions were going to collapse very fast, and something else entirely was going to rise up in their place. The review moved faster than she expected, and faster, she suspected, than Price had planned. Hartwick had initiated a formal personnel file disclosure request through command channels, the kind that required authorization above the regional command level, and that, once formally submitted, ran on a timeline driven by regulation rather than by anyone's preference for a particular outcome. DeLuca delivered this information to Mara in the flat, factual way she delivered everything. Full file pulled from the restricted archives, DeLuca said. Authorization went up to division level. That's all I've got. What Mara knew and had not said in the conference room was that her full file did not look like a standard nursing service record. It had never looked like one, because it wasn't one. The gaps that Price had cited as incomplete documentation were not gaps at all. They were sections that required specific clearance levels to access, sections that had been sealed because the work they documented wasn't supposed to be visible in a standard personnel system. The people who had filed concerns about her qualifications had looked at a redacted file and assumed the redactions meant absence. They were about to find out what they actually meant. She had kept the background quiet because she was tired of being defined by it. She had joined the medical integration program because she wanted to prove something that mattered to her, that she was worth something now, in this work, for what she could do today. Not because of where she had been before. The irony was almost clean. The people who had tried to remove her were about to produce the very evidence that made removal impossible. She was thinking about this on the 4th evening of her reassignment when the compound alarm activated. Not the drill tone, the real one, a rising 2-pulse signal that meant something had already happened and more was likely happening still. She heard it from the support ward corridor and was at the outer door before the second pulse finished. A runner came through at a dead sprint, nearly colliding with her in the doorway. Young, probably 23, face flushed and eyes wide in the specific way of someone whose body was already ahead of their mind. Active incident, the runner said, catching his breath between words. Building 7. Shots fired. Multiple reported casualties. Armed subject still inside. Medical response requested. All available personnel. Mara was already pulling her trauma bag from her locker as the runner was finishing the sentence. She checked the contents in 4 seconds. The same 4-second check she had run on this bag every morning since she'd arrived, slung it, and went through the door at a run. The distance from the medical support ward to Building 7 was roughly 300 meters across open compound ground. She covered it fast, and as she came around the corner of the motor pool, she could see 2 things simultaneously. Smoke rising from a second-floor window on the east side of the building, and a tactical element already stacking against the exterior wall near the main entrance. Rourke was at the lead position, hand signals moving. She heard the sound under the alarm before she saw the building, a sound that was somewhere between impact and atmosphere, the particular quality of a space where something violent had happened recently and might happen again. She came up on the tactical element's position at a controlled run, and Rourke saw her before she reached them. His expression in that moment went through surprise and calculation and something that looked like a decision, all in roughly 1 second. "Shooter is still inside," he said, his voice low and controlled. Unknown current position. One confirmed casualty in the lobby. We have visual through the glass. She looked through the lobby doors. A man was down on the tile floor inside, maybe 15 feet from the entrance. The blood under him was not pooling anymore, which meant his pressure was low and had been low for some time. And what that meant for his survival probability was a calculation she completed before she finished the visual assessment. "He'll be dead before you clear the building," she said. Rourke looked at the man, looked back at her. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sound of the alarm above them and the radio traffic around them and the movement of the rest of the element all continued, and in the middle of it there was a half-second of silence between them that was its own kind of decision. "Cover me," she said, and she went through the door. The lobby opened around her, wide and hard-surfaced and smelling of smoke and copper, and she was across the floor and down beside the casualty, with both hands moving before anyone on the outside had finished processing what she had done. The man was breathing, shallow, fast, the wrong rhythm, and she found the wound and got her hands on it and started the work. And somewhere above her in the building, a door slammed open and boots hit a staircase at speed. And the radio on her belt crackled with Rourke's voice giving positions to his element, and the whole building seemed to be deciding at once what happened next. She didn't look up. She kept her hands exactly where they needed to be. Whatever was coming down that staircase was going to arrive whether she was ready for it or not. She intended to be ready for it. The man on the floor was named Specialist Dario Vance, though Mara wouldn't learn that until later. Right now, he was just a casualty, mid-20s, athletic build working against him because muscle mass bled out faster than fat, GSW to the left lateral chest, exit wound present, which meant through and through, which meant she needed to seal both sides before his lung finished its collapse. She worked fast and she worked quiet. The lobby was glass on 3 sides. Floor-to-ceiling panels looking out onto the compound exterior, the kind of architecture that made a building feel open during normal operations and made it a fishbowl during an active shooter incident. She was aware of this without letting it occupy more than a fraction of her attention. The threat was inside the building. The glass was irrelevant to what she was doing. She sealed the entry wound with the materials she had, rolled him with her knee to access the exit, sealed that too, and started an assessment of what else she was dealing with. His pulse was there, weak, rapid, and inconsistent in a way that suggested she was running out of time rather than having enough of it. "Stay with me," she said. Not for his benefit, he was only partially conscious, but because saying it out loud kept her from getting ahead of herself, from moving to the next problem before she'd finished the current one. Above her, the building was not quiet. She could hear movement on the stairwell, the echo of boots on metal stairs, the particular acoustic quality of someone moving fast in an enclosed vertical space. She heard Rourke's voice on the radio, clipped and controlled, coordinating his element's entry through the east access point. She heard glass break somewhere on the second floor and then the silence that followed a break, which was somehow louder than the break itself. She did not look up from Vance. She had placed herself between the stairwell and her patient, which was a deliberate choice she had made in the first 2 seconds after she'd gone through the door and done her spatial assessment. If someone came down those stairs, they would reach her before they reached him. This was not heroism. It was geometry, and geometry was something she could work with. The stairwell door slammed open. She looked up. The man who came through it was not in uniform. He was heavy-set, somewhere in his 40s, wearing civilian work clothes with a shoulder bag that had been pushed behind him, and he had a pistol in his right hand that he was not holding with the grip of someone who had trained with it. He was holding it the way frightened people held things, too tight, arm extended too far, the muzzle tracking in small, erratic arcs rather than fixed on a point. His eyes moved from her to the lobby doors to the compound outside and back to her, and she could see the calculation happening in real time. Someone moving through a sequence of terrible options and not finding any of them good enough to commit to. She had her hands on Vance. She did not move them. "I need you to put that down," she said. Her voice came out level and steady, which was a function of training rather than the absence of adrenaline. The adrenaline was present and fully operational. She just wasn't letting it run anything. "Back up," the man said. His voice was tight and too high for the body it was coming from. "Back up. Get away from him." "I can't do that," Mara said. "He's bleeding out. If I take my hands off this wound, he dies. I'm not going to let that happen." I said back, I heard you. She kept her eyes on him. She was tracking the gun hand, the distance between them, 11 feet, maybe 12, and the body language that would tell her half a second before he made a decision whether that decision was going to require her to respond. What's your name? The question stopped him. People didn't ask for names in this situation. The question was a break in the expected script, and breaks in expected scripts created hesitation, and hesitation was something she could use. What is it? Because I'm Mara, she said, and I'm going to keep my hands on this wound until this man is stable, and whatever happens after that is going to happen. But right now I need about 4 more minutes, and then whatever you need to do, you can do it. Something in his face moved, not softening exactly, but shifting. The gun hand dropped 2 inches, not from decision, but from the weight of the moment catching up to him. She heard the east entry breach, the controlled crack of a door going in fast, and she saw the man's eyes snap to the sound, and she saw the gun hand come back up as the panic flooded back in, and she stopped calculating and acted. She swept her right hand off Vance's wound for 1 second, drew from the holster at her right hip with the same motion, and had the weapon up and on target before the man had fully processed that she had moved. She put the first round through his right shoulder, the gun arm, the threat arm, and the pistol left his hand and hit the floor tiles and skittered toward the lobby doors. He went sideways and down, his back against the stairwell wall, his left hand coming up to grab the right shoulder while the sound of the shot was still bouncing off the glass walls. She was back on Vance's wound before the second echo finished, both hands on the seal, pressure maintained. She heard the east side entry team come through the internal corridor fast, boots, radio crackle, the organized, controlled noise of trained people moving through a space they'd just cleared. And then Rourke was in the lobby doorway with 2 operators behind him, weapon up, scanning, and he took in the scene in about a second and a half. The downed gunman against the stairwell wall, his pistol 8 feet from his hand. Mara on the floor with both hands on Vance, her weapon back in its holster. Rourke stared at her. Vance needs a surgical team right now, she said. Seal tension pneumo, lost maybe 1.5 liters, blood pressure is wrong. I need a stretcher, and I need it in 90 seconds. Rourke's voice got on the radio before she finished the sentence. She heard him relay the medical request and the all-clear status simultaneously, and then he was next to her, crouched at Vance's other side, one hand on the man's shoulder, and he was looking at her with an expression that she didn't have a category for and didn't try to categorize right now. Is he going to make it? Rourke asked. If the surgical team gets here in the next 4 minutes, she said. Yes, 4 minutes, he said. He got back on the radio. She kept her hands exactly where they were and did not let herself think about anything other than the pressure and the rhythm of Vance's breathing and the clock. The surgical team arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was fast enough and also too close for comfort, and Mara briefed them in 20 words while she transferred care. She had done this enough times to know that a fast, clean handoff was worth more than a complete picture, because the complete picture was visible once the surgical team had their hands in, and what they needed right now was the specific critical information and then to be left alone to work. She stepped back. Her hands were covered in blood to the mid-forearm. There was a spray across the left side of her uniform from when she'd rolled Vance to access the exit wound. Her right knee had taken the full impact of a hard floor for the duration of the treatment and was registering that fact with the kind of dull, persistent complaint that she noted and deferred. The lobby was suddenly full of people. Compound security, responding medical staff, investigators in civilian clothes who had arrived with the speed that suggested they'd been nearby or on standby. Someone was processing the downed gunman, who was alive, conscious, and making sounds that were more exhausted than pained. Someone else was securing the stairwell. A third team was moving to the second floor. Rourke came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. They stood together and watched the surgical team work on Vance with the efficient, controlled urgency of people who were very good at what they did and knew it. And the silence between her and Rourke had a different quality than any silence they'd shared before. 2 shots, he said finally. 1, she said. The second was the floor. He turned to look at her. You drew off the wound. For 1 second. And then went back. He was still bleeding. Rourke looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him without performing anything, without offering an explanation or a qualification, because she didn't have the energy for it, and she also didn't think he needed one. He was processing something, and she was going to let him process it. Your restriction order, he said. The reassignment. Still in effect, she said. You're in a building you weren't cleared to be in, responding to an incident you were technically taken off the active roster for. A man was dying on the floor, she said. The roster can sort itself out. Something moved across Rourke's face that might have been the beginning of a complicated emotion he was choosing not to let finish. He looked away, looked at the investigators beginning their sweep of the lobby, looked at the gunman being stabilized near the stairwell. When they ask you what happened, he said, just tell them exactly what you told me. I plan to, she said. What? The questioning started 40 minutes later, in a conference room on the ground floor of the administration building that smelled of old coffee and new tension. There were two investigators, a woman named Salas from the compound security office, and a man named Breivik, who was from somewhere further up the chain and had the particular careful manner of someone assembling a record rather than seeking information. They were not unfriendly. They were precise in the way that people in official capacities were precise when the situation had already attracted attention above their level. Mara answered every question directly and completely. She did not editorialize. She did not contextualize or qualify beyond what was specifically asked. She described what she had seen, what she had assessed, what she had decided, and what she had done, in chronological order, without omission. When Breivik asked her about the shot, she described it the same way. One round, right shoulder, disabling shot on a target that was actively presenting a weapon at a moment when the East Entry team was executing a breach that had elevated the threat level. You assessed the situation in real time? Breivik said. Yes. And you determined that lethal force was not necessary? The shoulder shot was the appropriate response for the specific threat at that specific moment, she said. He was frightened. His weapon handling indicated limited training. The goal was threat neutralization, not escalation. Breivik wrote something down. You maintained patient care throughout. I removed my hands for approximately 1 second to draw and fire, she said. Then I went back to the wound. He wrote something else. Salas was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile, but very attentive, the way people looked when they were revising their expectation of what they were going to find and discovering the revision was significant. Ms. Voss, Breivik said, your current assignment status is reassigned to general medical support pending documentation review, she said. Yes, I'm aware. Which means your presence at Building 7 during an active incident was someone was dying, she said. I'm a medical professional. That's the only framework that matters to me in that moment. Breivik looked at her. He had a quality of stillness that she recognized from a certain type of person. Someone who had spent enough time in professional situations where things could go wrong in specific ways that they had learned to let information land before deciding what to do with it. We'll be in contact, he said. I'll be available, she said. She left the conference room and stood in the corridor outside for a moment, her back to the wall, and let herself acknowledge for the first time that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, not from the adrenaline anymore, but from the particular aftermath of holding it together for an extended period and allowing the body its delayed response now that it was over. She stood there for about 15 seconds. Then she pushed off the wall and went to find somewhere to wash her hands. What she didn't know, while she was being questioned in that conference room, was that a separate meeting was occurring simultaneously in Colonel Hartwick's office on the 3rd floor. She learned the shape of it later, from DeLuca, who had a talent for knowing what was happening in administrative spaces, and a philosophy that information was only useful when delivered to the right person. DeLuca found her in the staff break room late that evening, set 2 cups of coffee on the table without asking, and sat down. The file review came through, DeLuca said. Mara waited. Division authorized full disclosure. Hartwick got the complete package late this afternoon. DeLuca wrapped both hands around her cup. I don't have clearance to know what's in it, but I know what happened after she read it, because that part wasn't classified. What happened? Mara said. She called Price, DeLuca said, and then she called Price's commanding officer, and then she submitted a formal request to have the compatibility concerns removed from your program record on the grounds that they were filed in bad faith against a service member whose background wasn't visible to the filing parties and whose performance in the integration program had met every benchmark. Mara was quiet for a moment. Price is going to push back, she said. Price already pushed back, DeLuca said. This afternoon, about an hour after the Building 7 incident became official record. She took a sip of her coffee. That's the other thing you should know. Apparently what you did in that lobby, the casualty treatment, the tactical response, all of it, was captured on the building's internal security system. Full video, multiple angles. Mara looked at her. Breivik has it, DeLuca said, and someone above Breivik has it now. I don't know exactly who, but it went up fast. The implications of that arranged themselves in Mara's thinking with the methodical inevitability of falling pieces. A video of the incident meant a visual record of exactly what had happened and in what sequence. It meant the discrepancy between what she had done and what she had been formally characterized as incapable of doing was not a matter of competing testimonies. It was documented. It existed in a form that didn't require anyone to take her word for anything. It also meant that everyone who had filed concerns about her qualifications was going to have to reconcile those concerns with footage of her performing under conditions that made qualifications look like a theoretical concept. "How's Vance?" she asked. "Out of surgery," DeLuca said. "Stable. They're saying he'll be in recovery for 2 weeks minimum." She looked at Mara over the rim of her cup. Surgeon's report says the pre-op wound management was the reason the surgery was viable. If he'd lost another 6 to 8 minutes, the surgical team would have been working with not enough to work with. Mara nodded. She didn't feel triumphant about this, which surprised some people when they expected triumph and found something quieter instead. She felt the particular settling that came from having done the thing you were trained to do in the moment it was needed and having it be enough. That was its own kind of completion. It didn't require anything else attached to it. She drank her coffee. "What are they going to do with the gunman?" she said. "Breivik's team is still processing the incident. He's in the medical ward under guard. Shoulder wound, no other injuries. They'll be talking to him for a while." DeLuca set her cup down. "Early word is he was a former facilities contractor, terminated 8 months ago. Something about a dispute over a subcontracting arrangement that went sideways. Nobody knows yet what his plan actually was, whether this was targeted, opportunistic, or something else entirely." "Vance wasn't the target," Mara said. "The blood pattern when I first saw him, he was in the lobby. Wrong place." "That's what Salas thinks too," DeLuca said. "Working theory is Vance walked into the building during the initial incident and got caught in it." Mara nodded slowly. She thought about the man in the stairwell, the erratic gun hand, the eyes moving too fast, the voice pitched too high. He had not looked like someone executing a plan. He had looked like someone who had made a decision that felt necessary from the inside and catastrophic from the outside, and who was already understanding the difference between those two things by the time she'd seen him. "He asked me to back away from the casualty," she said. DeLuca looked at her. "When he came down the stairs, that was the first thing he said." She looked at her coffee cup. "I don't know what that means. I'm not the investigator, but it was the first thing." DeLuca absorbed this without comment, which was one of the things Mara had come to appreciate about her. She didn't fill space with responses that were only there to demonstrate that she was listening. "You should sleep," DeLuca said, standing. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." "More complicated than today?" "Different complicated," DeLuca said, and picked up her cup and left. Tomorrow arrived at 0612 in the form of a message delivered to her quarters by a compound runner, requesting her presence in Colonel Hartwick's office at 0800. The message used the word requesting, which was technically accurate in the grammatical sense and practically meaningless in a military context. But she noted the word choice anyway, because word choice in official communications was rarely accidental. She arrived at 0755. Hartwick's office was spare in the way of someone who had been in enough offices to understand that objects accumulated weight and weight slowed things down. A desk, 2 chairs, a single framed photograph on the credenza that was turned at an angle Mara couldn't read from where she sat. Hartwick came in at 0800 exactly, sat across from her, and placed a folder on the desk that Mara recognized as distinct from the folder Price had placed on the conference table. That one had been thin, performance management thin. This one was thick. "I'm going to speak directly," Hartwick said. "Please," Mara said. "Your full service record was disclosed to me yesterday afternoon under a division-level authorization. I've reviewed it." She didn't open the folder. She kept her hands flat on the desk and looked at Mara with the focused attention of someone who had stopped needing external props to anchor a conversation. I'm not going to summarize what's in it because most of it carries classification above this office, but I want you to understand that I have a complete picture now. Mara waited. The documentation concerns raised against you were frivolous, Hartwick said. Not technically flawed, frivolous. Filed by people who looked at a redacted file, saw what they expected to see, and weaponized it because they were uncomfortable with what you demonstrated on the range. She paused. I want to know if you knew this would happen. I thought it was possible, Mara said carefully. Did you anticipate it when you accepted the assignment? I anticipated some version of it, yes. Hartwick's expression didn't change in any large way, but something behind it shifted. Not approval exactly, but a kind of recognition. Why didn't you disclose your background proactively? Mara thought about how to answer this honestly. Because I've spent a long time having my background be the only thing people see, she said. When someone knows what you've done before, they stop watching what you're doing now. I wanted to be evaluated on current performance, without the context. And if the documentation questions had damaged your record before the file could be reviewed? I calculated that was a manageable risk, Mara said. You calculated incorrectly, Hartwick said. The file review would not have been fast enough if the Building 7 incident hadn't moved it up the chain. That was true, and Mara knew it. She hadn't factored an active incident into her probability assessment because an active incident was not a factor you could reasonably factor in, and Hartwick was right that it had changed the timing in a way that Mara's planning hadn't accounted for. She didn't argue the point. I understand, she said. Good. Hartwick opened the folder. She didn't remove anything from it. She looked at the top page for a moment. The compatibility concerns have been formally withdrawn from your program record, effective yesterday evening. The individuals who filed them have been informed that the concerns were inadmissible based on the disclosure review. There will be additional process on that front that I'm not fully briefed on yet. Price, Mara said. Price had the same incomplete picture everyone else had, Hartwick said. She acted on it. How much of what she did was genuine procedural concern, and how much was something else is a question for a process I'm also not running. She closed the folder. Your reinstatement to the integration program is effective immediately. The final assessment runs in 5 days. 5 days. She had 5 days to recover, recalibrate, and walk back into a unit that had watched her get pushed out and now had a very different set of information about who she was. The unit, Mara said. Yes, Hartwick said. They need to know what happened, not the classified details, but they need to understand what the documentation concerns actually were. A briefing is scheduled for 1400 today, Hartwick said. I'll be conducting it. I should be there. Hartwick looked at her steadily. You will be, she said. That's not optional. She had 4 hours before 1400, and she used most of them to sleep. Not because she wasn't running on the adrenaline aftermath of the previous day, but precisely because she was, and showing up to a room full of operators she needed to work with while running on fumes and cortisol was a category of mistake she was not going to make. She set an alarm, lay down in her bunk fully clothed, and was asleep in approximately 8 minutes. She woke 20 minutes before the briefing, changed, and went. The room was the same briefing room where she had sat in the second row on her first morning. The same configuration, the same overhead lighting that made everyone look faintly institutional. The operators were already seated when she came in, and the particular quality of the quiet that settled when she walked through the door told her that whatever Hartwick had communicated in advance to prepare them for the briefing, it had been enough to establish that something significant was happening. She took a seat. Not the second row this time. She sat in the first, and she sat in the middle, and she faced forward, and she kept her hand still on the desk in front of her while the room arranged itself around her. Greer was in her peripheral vision, 3 seats to her right. She did not look at him directly. Hartwick came in at exactly 1400 and did not wait. 3 subjects, the colonel said. Yesterday's incident, the documentation review, and the status of this unit going forward, in that order. She covered the Building 7 incident with the precision and economy of someone who valued both. She described the sequence of events, the casualty, the response, the outcome. She confirmed what the security footage showed. She identified Mara by name and role and described without embellishment what the medical response had consisted of, and what the investigation had determined about the tactical decision. "One round fired," Hartwick said. "Deliberate shoulder strike, threat neutralized. Patient care maintained throughout." She looked at the room. Specialist Vance is in stable recovery. The surgeon's assessment indicates the preoperative wound management was the determining factor in surgical viability. The room was very quiet. "Second subject," Hartwick said, "the documentation review." She covered it with the same economy. The disclosure authorization, the file review, the finding that the concerns had been inadmissible, the formal withdrawal. She named Greer. She named the two others who had gone to Price. She did not soften any of it, and she did not turn it into a moral lecture, which made it land harder than a lecture would have. Greer did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the desk in front of him and looked forward and said nothing. "Third subject," Hartwick said. "This unit goes into final integration assessment in 5 days. Voss is reinstated effective immediately and will be participating. That is not a discussion item." She let a pause settle. "Any questions about the assessment logistics can come to me directly. Anything else can wait until you've had time to think." She left. The room stayed still for about 4 seconds, and then it came back to life in the uneven, overlapping way that rooms did after briefings. Chairs moving, people standing, the resumption of ordinary sound that was slightly different now from what it had been before. Mara gathered her notebook and started to stand. "Voss?" "Greer." She turned. He was standing 3 feet away, which was closer than their entire previous acquaintance had prepared her for. His expression was doing several things at once, none of them comfortable, all of them, she thought, genuine. "I want to—" He stopped. Tried again. "What I filed. The concerns." He stopped again. She waited. "It was wrong," he said. "It came out flat and direct. The way people said things when they'd decided to say them rather than when they'd performed saying them. I looked at your file, saw what I thought I saw, and He exhaled. "I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who found this easy. She could see that. She wasn't interested in making it easier for him, but she was also not interested in making it harder. "I know," she said. He nodded once, sharply, like a period at the end of a sentence. She was almost out the door when Rourke fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, just walked with her down the corridor the way people walked when they had something to say and hadn't yet decided on the order. 5 days, he said finally. 5 days, she agreed. "Your knee's going to be a problem on the movement drills," he said. "I saw how you came up off the floor in the lobby." She glanced at him. "It's fine." "It's not, but you'll manage anyway." He paused. "There's a physical therapy room in the East Medical Building. They have ice and a foam roller and nobody's in there at 05:30. She processed this. It was not quite an offer and not quite advice. It was the kind of statement that created an option without requiring acknowledgement. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He nodded and peeled off toward the operations building, and Mara walked back toward the medical ward alone, thinking about 5 days and what she needed them to accomplish, and thinking also about the video footage that Breivik had confirmed was now above his level in the chain, and wondering where exactly it had gone, and what the people watching it were deciding. She got her answer sooner than she expected. The message was waiting on her bunk when she returned to her quarters. Not a printed form, not a runner's verbal relay, but an envelope with a seal she recognized from her previous life. A seal she had not expected to see here. A seal that meant the chain hadn't just moved up from Breivik's level, but had moved up considerably further than that. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the envelope for a moment. She had calculated, when she'd accepted this assignment, that her background would eventually surface. She had not calculated this particular vector. This was not the documentation review path. This was a different path entirely, one that originated somewhere else and had been moving in her direction for reasons that had nothing to do with the integration program, or Price's concerns, or Greer's filing, or even what had happened in Building 7 yesterday. She opened the envelope. She read the single page inside once, carefully, and then read it again. Then she sat very still on the edge of her bunk with the page in her hands and understood that what she had thought was the end of the problem was, in fact, nowhere near the end of anything. The page was from a colonel named Aldrich Thorne. She didn't know him by face, she had never met him in person, but she knew the office he represented, because she had worked under the umbrella of that office for nearly 3 years of her life, in circumstances and locations that were not in any file accessible below a division-level clearance. The letterhead didn't name the unit. It didn't need to. The seal was sufficient, and the seal told her that what she was holding had not originated as a response to anything that had happened at Hargrove. It had originated before she arrived. The letter was 8 sentences. She read it twice, not because the language was complex, but because the implications required a second pass to fully arrange themselves. Colonel Thorne's office had been monitoring the integration program assignment since before her transfer orders were cut. There was a situation, the word used was situation, which in the context of that seal meant something considerably larger than the word suggested, that had developed in a way that made her specific background relevant. She was being formally requested to make herself available for a meeting at 800 the following morning. Location provided at the bottom. Not the administrative building, not the integration compound. A civilian address in Callaway proper. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. Then she lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought carefully about what she was going to do next, which was the same thing she had always done before making any decision that carried this kind of weight. She constructed the situation as completely as she could with the information available, identified the variables she couldn't control, and decided how she would behave regardless of how those variables landed. She had left that world deliberately. She had left it because the work had costs that accumulated over years in ways that didn't show up on any performance evaluation, and she had reached a point where the accumulation was approaching something she didn't want to become. The medical integration program had been the first step of a deliberate transition toward work that still demanded everything she had, but demanded it in the direction of keeping people alive rather than in the direction of other things. The letter from Thorne's office was a hand reaching back across that transition. She didn't sleep well. She noted that without judgment and got up at 0500 anyway. The physical therapy room in the East Medical Building was exactly where Rourke had described it. Small, equipment dense, empty at this hour. She spent 40 minutes working the knee, which was angrier than she'd acknowledged to Rourke, and more limited in its range than she'd assessed the previous day, when adrenaline had been doing some of the functional work. The foam roller produced the specific kind of pain that was useful rather than alarming, and by the time she was done, the mobility was better, which was not the same as good, but was good enough for what the next 5 days required. She ran 3 kilometers on the compound track before the rest of the base was fully operational, showered, ate something that approximated breakfast, and was in her car and on the road toward the civilian address in Callaway by 07:50. The address was a commercial building on the east side of Callaway's small downtown, a nondescript 2-story structure that had been a law office in its previous life, judging by the ghost lettering still faintly visible on the ground floor window glass. Inside, a man she didn't recognize checked her credentials with the thoroughness of someone who had done this many times before, and then led her up a staircase that smelled of new carpet and old building, to a room on the second floor where Colonel Aldrich Thorne was waiting. Thorne was older than she had pictured, mid-60s, lean, with the kind of face that had resolved decades ago into permanent unreadability. He was in civilian clothes, which told her this meeting was off the record in the formal sense, which meant it was more consequential than an on-record meeting would have been. Off-record conversations were where things were actually decided. He stood when she came in and shook her hand with the directness of someone who considered social ritual a delivery mechanism for information rather than a courtesy. "Voss," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He sat. "I'll tell you why you're here," he said, "and then I want your honest assessment. Not the assessment you think I want, the one you actually have." "Understood," she said. "The Building 7 incident," Thorne said. "The gunman. His name is Warren Holt, former facilities contractor, as the initial report indicates. But the contracting arrangement in question was not with this compound." She waited. "It was with a logistics subcontractor that services 3 regional military installations, including 2 that fall under the operational umbrella of my office." He folded his hands on the table. "Holt's termination 8 months ago was connected to an internal audit that uncovered a financial discrepancy in a supply chain that touches classified materiel movement." The shape of it began to arrange itself in her thinking before he finished the sentence. "He wasn't a disgruntled contractor," she said. "He was," Thorne said, He was also potentially a threat in something larger. We don't know yet. The investigation is 3 days old and moving fast. He looked at her steadily. What I know is that the incident yesterday was not random, and what I need to know, what my office needs to know quickly, is whether Holt said anything to you during the confrontation that you didn't include in your statement to Breivik. She thought about it, not performing thought, actually running through the exchange in the lobby, the 45 seconds between Holt coming through the stairwell door and going down to the floor. He told me to back away from the casualty, she said. I reported that. Word for word. Back up, get away from him. She paused. Him. Not the casualty. Him. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted by a degree. You noted that at the time? I noted it and didn't know what to do with it, she said. Vance was a wrong place casualty by every other indicator. But Holt used a specific pronoun. He may have been referring to Vance generically, Thorne said. He may not have been. He unfolded his hands. My office is going to need access to your full interview with Breivik's team. We're also going to need you available for follow-up questioning as the Holt investigation develops. I have a program assessment in 5 days, she said. I'm aware. He looked at her without apology. This takes priority. She absorbed that. She had known, reading his letter, that something like this was the sentence at the end of it. She had come here prepared for it, and was still, in some specific and honest way, frustrated by it, because the assessment mattered to her in a way that was separate from strategic career calculation. It mattered because she had earned it, and because the people who had tried to take it from her hadn't succeeded, and walking away from it now felt like a concession she hadn't agreed to make. How much of my time, she said, as much as the investigation requires. That's not a number. No, he said. It's not. He studied her. I'm not asking you to return to operational status. I'm asking you to be available for questioning and consultation as this develops. That's the extent of the formal ask. She looked at him for a moment. What's the informal ask? A pause. Brief, but present. That you tell me if anything else about that lobby encounter comes back to you, he said. Anything that didn't fit. Any detail that you set aside because the immediate situation didn't have room for it. She thought about this more carefully now. The lobby, the smoke smell, Vance on the floor, Holt coming through the stairwell, the gun hand, the voice, the eyes moving in the specific pattern of someone processing bad options. Him. Get away from him. He knew Vance, she said. Thorne looked at her. It's not certain, she said quickly, but the way he said it, it wasn't generic. The pronoun had weight. She shook her head slightly. That's not evidence. That's instinct. Document it anyway, Thorne said. Write it up exactly as you just said it to me. Instinct with context is still data. She nodded. He stood, which was the signal the meeting was ending. You'll hear from my office, probably within 48 hours. He extended his hand again. You handled yesterday well. Everything I've reviewed indicates you handled it the way it needed to be handled. A man almost died, she said. Yes, Thorne said, and didn't. He said it without suggesting that was the end of the complexity, which she appreciated. She drove back to the compound in the early morning light and thought about Warren Holt and what him meant, and how much of what had happened in Building 7 was a beginning rather than an event. The integration program didn't pause for external investigations, which Mara had known and had told herself she was at peace with, and discovered, in the concrete reality of the next 48 hours, she was mostly, but not entirely, at peace with. The 5 days to assessment were moving whether she was ready or not, and Hartwick had made it clear that reinstatement meant participation on the full schedule, which meant the same rotations, the same drills, the same qualification elements that the rest of the cohort had been running while she was in the support ward. She was behind on 2 of the field exercise scenarios. She caught up in 36 hours, which required her to run the scenarios back-to-back during hours that other people were using for recovery, and to manage the knee with more ice and less pride than she would have preferred. Farley ran the makeup rotations with the same unornamented precision he applied to everything, and if he had opinions about her return to the program, he kept them where they didn't interfere with the work. The unit's adjustment to her presence was uneven and imperfect in the way that adjustments to significant new information always were. Greer was quieter around her, which wasn't the same as warmer, but was meaningfully different from where they'd started. The two operators who had filed alongside him made no direct approach. They worked in proximity to her during drills without hostility and without ease, which was probably the realistic best case given the timeline. A few others in the unit who had maintained functional neutrality through the documentation dispute found it easier now, which she understood to be less about her and more about the removal of ambiguity. Rourke worked with her the way he worked with everyone, directly, technically, without ceremony. But he also started including her in the informal tactical conversation that happened at the edges of formal drills, the shorthand discussion among the more experienced operators about why a scenario was built the way it was and what it was actually designed to test beneath the surface structure. She wasn't always sure whether this was deliberate integration or simply Rourke operating the way he operated and letting the chips land. She decided it didn't matter which. On the third day before the assessment, the Thorne situation escalated. She was in the middle of a medical scenario, complex, multi-casualty, designed specifically to stress decision-making under competing demands, when her radio crackled with a code that was not part of the exercise. She recognized it because she had been told to listen for it. Thorne's office, requesting immediate contact. She flagged the scenario pause to the drill cadre, stepped out, and made the call. The voice on the other end wasn't Thorne. It was the man who had checked her credentials at the civilian building. Younger voice, crisper delivery, the kind of tone that appeared when a situation had moved from developing to urgent. Holt gave a secondary statement this morning, he said. He's cooperating with the investigation. He's named a contact. Who? She said. Someone inside Hargrove. A pause that was too deliberate to be anything but prepared. He's named a major. The name is Cass. She stood very still in the corridor outside the drill hangar. Cass. Personnel assessment. The man who had sat in the corner of the conference room during her documentation review meeting, uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who hadn't fully agreed to be there. She had read him as conflicted. She had not read him as complicit, which told her something about the limits of her own assessment capability that she filed away for later. What's the nature of the connection? She said. The supply chain audit that led to Holt's termination, Cass was the reviewing officer on the administrative side. The investigation is working a theory that the audit findings were manipulated before they went up the chain, and that the manipulation originated inside the compound. Cass had access to personnel files, she said. He had access to a great deal, the voice said. The documentation concerns filed against you. The investigation wants to know if those were purely personal bias or whether removing you from the integration program served another purpose. She thought about this. She thought about the timing, the concerns filed after her qualification scores, yes, but also after she had been inside the compound for 10 days. After she had been in briefings, in the corridors, in the spaces where people moved information around without always accounting for who was listening. Someone didn't want me here, she said slowly, not because of performance. That's the theory being worked, the voice said. Nothing confirmed, but Thorne wants you aware, and he wants you to report anything from the past 2 weeks that seemed anomalous outside of the performance context. Things you heard, saw, that didn't fit. She thought about what she had stored and not yet retrieved, the conversations she had cataloged as terrain information, the moments that had felt off-register without being specific enough to act on. I'll need to sit with it, she said. You have until 1800 today, he said, and ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then went back into the drill hangar and told the cadre she was ready to continue. She finished the scenario. She performed adequately, not her best because part of her thinking was elsewhere, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. And she debriefed it with Farley without mentioning anything about the call, because the investigation was not Farley's domain, and mixing the two would make both worse. After the debrief, she went to her quarters, sat at her desk, and wrote for 2 hours. She wrote everything she could retrieve from the past 2.5 weeks. Not narrative, lists, essentially, of observations organized by date and context, conversations overheard, anomalous body language in people she'd interacted with, logistical details that had seemed incidental at the time. She wrote Cass's behavior in the conference room, the specific quality of his discomfort, the way he had looked at Price at certain moments during the documentation meeting. She wrote the timing of the compatibility concerns and compared it against the supply chain audit timeline that Thorne's office had given her. The picture that emerged was not clean. Real pictures never were. But there was a shape to it, a possible shape, the kind that an investigation could use as a framework, even if it couldn't use her observations as evidence. She sent the document through the secure channel Thorne's office had given her and looked at the time. 17:42. She had 18 minutes to spare and a knock on her door. She opened it. Rourke stood in the corridor with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the testing assessment of their first days, not the focused intensity of the Building 7 lobby, not the careful recalibration of the briefing room. This was something raw, something that had been compressed and was now, by necessity or decision or both, decompressing. "Can I come in?" he said. She stood aside. He came in, stood in the center of the small room, and looked at her with the directness of someone who had made up his mind to say something and was not going to perform preamble about it. "Cass was arrested 20 minutes ago," he said. "Compound security, MP escort. They walked him out of the personnel building in front of half the unit." She said nothing. "People are talking," Rourke said, connecting it to the documentation concerns. "To you." He exhaled. "I want to know. I know I'm not entitled to the full picture, but I need to know if what happened in that conference room was connected to what happened in Building 7. She looked at him. He had asked the question directly, and he deserved a direct answer to the portion she could actually answer. "Possibly," she said. "The investigation is ongoing. I can't give you more than that." "Was any of it about me?" he said. "My unit?" "I don't think so," she said. "I think I was a problem to be removed. The unit was incidental." He absorbed this. He stood in the center of her small room with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the particular way of someone receiving information that was both worse and better than what they'd feared, and she watched him process it without trying to accelerate or ease the process. "Greer came to me today," he said, "separately from whatever's happening with Cass. He asked me if he should request a formal retraction of the concerns from the program record." "Hartwick already had them removed," she said. "He knows. He wants to go on record himself. His name, saying he was wrong." He paused. "I told him that was his call to make, not mine." She nodded slowly. "Was that the right answer?" he said. "Yes," she said. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable settled between them, the kind of silence that showed up after a lot of information had been exchanged, and both people were letting it find its level. "The assessment is in 2 days," Rourke said. "I know. Your knee." "Will hold," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was evaluating and something else underneath the evaluation, something she noted and did not pursue because the timing was wrong and the context was wrong, and there were things that needed to resolve before other things could begin. "Okay," he said simply, and left. She sat back down at her desk and looked at the wall and thought about Cass being walked out of the personnel building in front of the unit, and what that meant for the threads Thorne's office was pulling, and whether the thread that led to Holt led somewhere that was finished or somewhere that was only just beginning to surface. The night before the final assessment, Mara did not sleep well for the second time in a week, which was 2 times more than she liked. The knee woke her at 0300 with a specific insistence that she could no longer fully ignore, and she lay in the dark for an hour running through the assessment format, the known variables, the gaps she needed to be sharp enough to cover. She also spent some of that hour thinking about Holt, about the word him, about what Cass's arrest meant for the investigation's timeline, and about the letter from Thorne's office that she had carried in her jacket for 3 days like a stone she'd picked up from a road and wasn't ready to put down. At 400, she got up, put on her running shoes, and went outside. The compound at this hour was the quietest it ever got. A handful of security personnel on rotation, the lights over the motor pool casting long shadows over empty ground, the distant sound of wind across the desert that surrounded Callaway on 3 sides. She ran the track at a pace she'd stopped calling easy and started calling sustainable, which was a distinction that mattered more as she got older. The knee held. She ran until the sky at the eastern edge of the compound began to change from black to the particular gray that preceded dawn, and then she stopped and stretched and thought about nothing specific for approximately 5 minutes, which was more mental rest than she had allowed herself in days. She was walking back toward the medical building when the alarm went off. Not the active incident alarm. The medical emergency alarm. A different tone, single continuous pulse, specific to situations inside the compound medical facilities. She broke into a run before she had consciously decided to. She hit the door of the medical ward at a run and nearly collided with a nurse named Baxter, who was coming the other direction at equal speed. "What is it?" Mara said. "Recovery ward," Baxter said, already moving back the way she'd come. "Vance." Mara followed her through the corridor at a jog, through 2 sets of doors, into the recovery ward where specialist Dario Vance had been stable for the past 3 days. The recovery ward was small, 4 beds, currently with 2 occupied, and when she came through the door, the picture was immediately clear. Vance was in distress. His monitor was reading a heart rate that was wrong in the specific way of someone whose recently repaired chest was developing a problem, and the recovery nurse was already on the phone requesting surgical backup, and Baxter was pulling the crash cart, and Vance himself was conscious, barely, eyes open, trying to speak. Mara moved to his side and got her hands on him and started the assessment. The chest seal was intact. The surgery sites looked normal on visual inspection. His breathing was labored in a way that had developed based on the monitor history she could read on the screen over the past 22 minutes, a gradual deterioration that had tripped the alarm threshold 8 minutes ago. "How long has he been on this O2 rate?" she said to Baxter. "Since transfer from surgical." 40%. "His SAT is dropping. Get me a non-rebreather, get me a chest x-ray request in now, and I need someone to call Farley." She had her stethoscope on his chest as she spoke. Left side. Diminished. Not absent, but wrong. Something was reaccumulating. "Vance," she said, "can you hear me?" His eyes moved to her face. "I need you to stay as still as you can," she said. "I know it's hard to breathe. I know. Stay still." His lips moved. "Don't try to talk," she said. His lips moved again, with the specific insistence of someone who was prioritizing communication over comfort, which meant the communication was something he considered important enough to spend limited oxygen on. She leaned closer. "Not an accident," he said. The words came out broken, each one costing him. "Cass, before, he told me—" "Vance. He told me to stay out of Building 7. His eyes were fixed on her with an urgency that cut through the pain and the oxygen deficit and the effort of speaking. "Day before, he told me specifically, stay out." She straightened up and her hands kept working and her face showed nothing, and inside she was processing what he had just said, and its implications were landing like physical weight, stacking fast. Vance had been warned away from Building 7 the day before the incident, which meant someone had known the incident was coming, which meant Holt's presence in that building had not been the impulsive action of a desperate man who had made a terrible decision. It had been planned, at least in part, by someone who had been able to warn a specific person away from the target location 24 hours in advance. And Cass was now in MP custody, and Thorne's office was 3 days into an investigation that had started as a supply chain audit and had become something else entirely. And somewhere in all of this was a picture that she had partial pieces of, and that was going to look very different once the remaining pieces were in place. Farley came through the door at a controlled run, took the clinical picture in 2 seconds, and was at the bedside with his hands already moving. "I've got him," he said to Mara. She stepped back. She watched Farley work with the focused efficiency she had come to associate with him. And she watched Vance's monitor, and she kept what Vance had told her in the front of her mind with the specific kind of controlled urgency of someone carrying information that needed to move fast and couldn't move carelessly. Farley stabilized him in 11 minutes. The deterioration had been a small pleural effusion, fluid reaccumulating post-surgery, manageable if caught early, dangerous if not. He had caught it early. When Farley stepped back from the bed and stripped his gloves, he looked at Mara with the expression of a man who had caught something in the room's atmosphere that hadn't been on the clinical chart. "What did he tell you?" Farley said. "Something that needs to go to Thorne's office in the next 30 minutes, she said. Farley looked at her for a long moment. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who asked questions he didn't need the answers to. "Go," he said. She went. She was in the corridor pulling out the secure contact information from Thorne's office when she nearly walked into the man who was standing just outside the recovery ward door. He was in uniform. She didn't recognize him. Mid-30s, compact, The bearing of someone with operational background, a base ID clipped to his jacket that she clocked automatically, and then looked at again because something about the format was slightly wrong in a way that would take a second to articulate. He looked at her. She looked at him. He smiled. It was a calm smile, and it was wrong in the same way his ID was wrong, and she understood in the same instant what both of those things meant. Wrong format, wrong smile, wrong person to be standing outside this specific ward at 4:16 in the morning when no routine shift change explained the presence. Her hand moved toward her radio. His hand moved faster. His hand moved faster, but not toward her. He pressed something against his own jacket. A radio, she registered, clipped to his left side, and stepped back half a pace with his hands open and visible, and said very quietly, "Voss, I'm with Thorne's office. Don't draw." She didn't draw. She also didn't relax because people who were actually with Thorne's office identified themselves before they appeared in corridors at 0416 outside recovery wards, and the ID format was still wrong, and a man telling you not to draw was not the same as a man giving you a reason not to. "Show me something real," she said. Her voice came out level. Her hand stayed where it was. He reached slowly into his jacket, the kind of slow that was deliberate communication, not hesitation, and produced a credential wallet that was different from the base ID clipped to his jacket. He held it open at reading distance. She read it. She read it twice. It was real. The format, the seal, the classification indicator in the lower right corner, all of it was correct in the ways that mattered and that she would know because she had carried a version of this wallet herself. "Your base ID is wrong," she said. "Cover credential," he said. "I've been on compound for 6 days, different identity." 6 days, she said. "Since before Holt's incident." He pocketed the wallet. "My name is Reyes. I'm the secondary investigator on Thorne's operation. I've been running a parallel track on the compound while the primary investigation worked Holt from the outside." She looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at things when she needed to see past the surface presentation and get to the structure underneath. He was calm in a way that wasn't performed. He was also slightly tired, the kind of tired that accumulated over days of sustained alertness. And he was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had been briefed on who she was and was now reconciling the brief with the person. "What parallel track?" she said. "Cass wasn't working alone," Reyes said. "We've known that since day 2. He's a middle layer. The supply chain compromise has at least 2 more nodes above him on the inside, and we have names for one of them." He glanced toward the recovery ward door. "What did Vance tell you?" She told him. Reyes processed it without visible reaction, which was itself a reaction. He'd either already known or had suspected, and either way the confirmation was landing differently than surprise would have. "Cass warned Vance away," Reyes said. "The day before," she said, "which means Cass knew the timeline." He exhaled through his nose. "We've been working the theory that Cass was an information node, someone who passed logistics data up the chain without necessarily knowing the full operational picture. If he knew the Building 7 timeline, the picture is bigger than that. Or he was protecting Vance specifically," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Reyes looked at her. "You think there's a personal connection. I think the warning was specific and targeted, and that takes more than logistics access. It takes knowledge of Vance as an individual." She paused. "That's instinct, not evidence. But I already told Thorne's office once tonight to document the instinct." "And you were right the first time," Reyes said. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, actual paper, which told her something about how he'd been operating for the past 6 days, and wrote something. "I need you available for a full debrief at 0600, not the civilian building. There's a secured room in the base legal office that Thorne's team has been using." "I have the final integration assessment today," she said. "I know," he said. "We're not asking you to miss it. We need 2 hours before it starts." She looked at the time, 4:27. "I'll be there at 600, she said. He nodded, clipped the notebook shut, and moved down the corridor with the unhurried pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be and didn't need to perform urgency to get there. She watched him until he turned the corner, then stood alone in the corridor for a moment, thinking about 6 days and cover credentials, and the fact that Thorne's office had embedded a secondary investigator inside the compound before Building 7 happened. which meant the supply chain investigation had already identified Hargrove as a compromised environment before anyone on the compound had known they were being watched, which meant the documentation concerns against her and her removal from the integration program had occurred inside a compound that was already under active investigation, which meant someone, at some level, had been watching all of it happen. She went back to her quarters and changed into her uniform and did not attempt to sleep. What? The secured room in the base legal office held Reyes, a woman Mara hadn't met named Investigator Dahl, who was efficient and sharp and conducted the debrief with the organized precision of someone who had done this enough times that the format was invisible, and a video link to Thorne himself, whose face on the screen looked like it had been awake for approximately the same number of consecutive hours as hers. The debrief ran 94 minutes. She went through everything, her complete documented observations from the 2.5 weeks, the conference room meeting, Price's behavior, Cass's specific expressions and timing in the documentation review meeting, the Building 7 incident and sequence, Vance's statement, and the corridor encounter with Reyes. Dahl asked precise follow-up questions. Thorne listened without interrupting except twice, and both interruptions were single-sentence clarifications rather than redirections. When it was done, Thorne leaned forward on the screen. "I'm going to tell you where the investigation is," he said, "because you're in it whether you plan to be or not, and you need the picture." She waited. "Cass has been cooperating since his arrest," Thorne said. "He's given us 2 names above him in the internal network. One is a logistics officer we've already moved on. He was transferred off compound this morning, 0:30, before the base was operational. The second name is more complicated." He paused in the way of someone choosing words with the care they deserved. "Lieutenant Colonel Price," he said. The name landed without drama. Mara received it without drama. She had not seen it coming with certainty, but she had sensed the shape of something in Price's behavior in that conference room. The folder placed with too much deliberateness, the language calibrated with too much precision, the pushing back on the written summary request in a way that went slightly beyond procedural preference. She had read it as someone protecting a process. It had been someone protecting themselves. "Price is the regional command oversight representative," Mara said, which gave her visibility into personnel assignments, program rosters, and documentation review processes across 3 integrated facilities, Thorne said, including the facilities serviced by the compromised supply chain. He looked at her through the screen. "The documentation concerns filed against you. We believe Price identified you as a risk when your assignment came across her desk. Not because of your qualifications, because your background clearance level, if disclosed through the review process, would have generated attention from offices that were already uncomfortably close to what Price's network was running. She tried to remove me before my file could be properly reviewed," Mara said, "because a proper review would have brought in people with clearance levels that overlapped with her operation." "That's the theory we're working," Thorne said. "Cass's cooperation supports it. He's stated that Price directed the documentation action. The compatibility concerns were her architecture, not Greer's idea." Mara thought about Greer, the genuine discomfort in his face when he'd stood 3 feet from her in the briefing room and said I was wrong in the flat, direct way of someone who had meant it. He had been used. His bias had been a tool that someone with an operational agenda had picked up and aimed. "Greer doesn't know this," she said. "No," Thorne said. "That will be handled through appropriate channels." "He should know," she said. "He filed those concerns because he was genuinely skeptical of me, and someone with a completely different motive used that to build a process designed to move me out. Those are 2 different things, and he needs to understand they're 2 different things." Thorne looked at her for a moment. "That's not your call to make," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm making the observation. You can decide what to do with it." A brief pause on the screen. "Noted," he said. "Where's Price now?" Mara asked. "Under administrative hold at Regional Command. The MP action is being coordinated to coincide with the conclusion of the compound-level arrests so that the network doesn't have time to collapse inward before we have everyone." He looked at her steadily. "That coordination is happening today. This morning, specifically." She understood what he was not quite saying. "The assessment," she said, "runs on schedule," Thorne said. "We don't move on Price until 1100, which gives your program assessment time to begin before the compound knows what's happening. He paused. I want you in that assessment, Voss. Not because we need coverage, because you earned it, and because the timing of the arrests shouldn't take it from you. She looked at him through the screen and felt something that was complicated and not entirely comfortable. Gratitude that had an edge of something like grief attached to it, because it was being offered by someone from the world she'd deliberately left. And the offering of it meant that world had its eye on her in a way she'd been trying to move away from. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Go do your job, he said, and the screen went dark. The final integration assessment began at 0900 in the main training complex, and it was everything the preceding 8 weeks had been building toward. A full-day evaluation covering tactical medical response, cross-functional team integration, decision-making under compound stress, and a live scenario exercise in the afternoon that was designed to be genuinely difficult and was, as far as Mara could assess walking into it, genuinely difficult. She had 2 hours of sleep behind her, a knee that was functional but vocal, and the knowledge that somewhere above the compound, a series of arrests was being coordinated to occur in approximately 2 hours. She focused on what was in front of her. The morning portion was individual evaluation, medical stations running concurrent with tactical assessments, each component scored by a separate evaluator and aggregated at the end. She moved through the medical stations with the methodical attention she'd brought to every drill, and the fatigue was present but manageable, and the knee held. She had learned over the years that the body could be reasoned with up to a point, and that the point was further out than most people thought, and that the negotiation required honesty about what you were asking it to do. Between stations, she caught fragments of the compound's atmosphere shifting around her. Word traveled in military environments at the speed of radio traffic and human movement, and something was moving through Hargrove's corridors by 0930 that wasn't the normal current of operational business. She saw 2 security vehicles cross the compound in a direction that didn't align with routine patrol. She caught the edge of a conversation between 2 base staff members near the water station that cut off when she approached. At 10:47, the compound PA system announced a mandatory administrative hold on non-essential personnel movement. Neutral language, the kind used for a range of administrative events, but the timing was not neutral. Thorne's office was moving. She returned her attention to the assessment station in front of her and completed the hemorrhage control scenario in 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which was 12 seconds faster than her previous best on a comparable scenario, which she attributed less to improvement and more to the particular clarity that arrived when there was nothing left to be distracted by. The morning scores were posted at 11:30. She ranked first in the medical component. Rourke ranked first in the tactical component. 2 others ranked above her in the cross-functional integration section, which she had expected. They had more years of integrated operations experience, and the gap in that category was real, rather than a function of circumstances. She noted it and filed it as useful information about where her development work needed to go. The afternoon scenario briefing happened at 1300, and by then the compound knew. Not everything. Not the operational details of the investigation, or the names above Cass in the network, or what Price was facing at regional command. But Hargrove was a small environment, and the administrative hold, the security vehicles, the absence of the logistics officer who had been transferred before dawn, and the lingering presence of unfamiliar faces in civilian clothes near the administrative buildings had assembled themselves in people's minds into the general shape of something significant happening. The unit assembled for the scenario briefing in a different configuration than it had assembled for anything before. There was an alertness in the room that wasn't quite tension and wasn't quite excitement, the particular heightened state of people who understood they were inside a moment rather than moving through an ordinary day. Hartwick gave the scenario briefing herself, which was unusual. The final assessment scenarios were typically run by the cadre. The colonel's presence in the briefing room added a layer to the atmosphere that nobody commented on and everybody noticed. The scenario is a mass casualty event in a multi-building complex with an active threat component, Hartwick said. Medical and tactical elements will need to coordinate in real time. Roles are assigned. There is no script. Your performance will be evaluated on decision quality, adaptation, and cross-functional effectiveness. She looked at the room. Any questions about the setup? No one asked. Then we begin in 20 minutes, she said. She started to turn away, then stopped. She looked at Mara directly, which she had not done in a briefing context before. Voss. A word. The unit filed out. Mara stayed. Hartwick waited until the room was empty. Then she turned back and looked at Mara with the expression of a woman who was holding more information than she was authorized to share and was deciding how much of it to put into words. "The situation at Regional Command," Hartwick said. "Yes," Mara said. "You know more about it than I do," Hartwick said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement about the topology of the investigation and where Mara sat within it. "Some," Mara said. "Price," Hartwick said. "Yes." Hartwick was still for a moment. "The documentation action, the concerns." "Directed," Mara said, "not by Greer." Something moved across Hartwick's face that was complicated and human and briefly visible before the professional composure resettled over it. She had run a clean program, and someone inside her chain had used it as operational cover, and that was not something a person like Hartwick received without cost. "I should have moved faster on the file review," Hartwick said. "You moved as fast as the process allowed," Mara said. "The process was being managed against you." "Yes, and you initiated the disclosure request anyway." Mara looked at her directly. "That matters." Hartwick held her gaze for a long moment. "Go run your scenario," she said. "Do it well." "I intend to," Mara said. The scenario was set in the Eastern Training Complex, 3 connected buildings with a layout that the cadre had deliberately not fully briefed, so that the teams were operating with partial information and had to build the picture in real time. The mass casualty setup included 15 simulated casualties distributed across the buildings at varying severity levels, a simulated active threat that required tactical clearance before medical access in certain zones, and a communications element that degraded progressively through the scenario to stress improvised coordination. Mara was assigned to the medical lead role for the primary casualty zone, which meant she was coordinating the medical response across the team rather than working individual casualties. It was a different skill set from direct treatment, more spatial, more probabilistic, requiring her to maintain a picture of the entire medical situation while making real-time decisions about resource allocation and priority sequencing that affected outcomes she couldn't always directly see. She found it harder than direct treatment, which she had expected and which was, she suspected, part of why the role had been assigned to her. She coordinated the triage sequencing across 3 simultaneous casualty sites, managed 2 resource conflicts when the simulated supply constraints created a competition between casualty zones that had no clean answer, and made one decision in the middle phase of the scenario that she knew as she made it was defensible but not clearly correct. A triage call that prioritized one casualty profile over another based on transport timeline assumptions that turned out to be slightly wrong when the communications degradation hit earlier than she'd modeled. The casualty she had deprioritized survived the scenario. The margin was narrow enough that she noted it. After the scenario ended and the cadre was walking through the evaluation with the team, one of the evaluators, a senior medic named Tully, who had a reputation for giving feedback that was precise to the point of being uncomfortable, stopped at the triage decision. "Walk me through the prioritization call," Tully said to Mara. She walked him through it. She included the assumption that had been incorrect. She didn't hedge the error or reframe it as a situational inevitability. She named it as a decision made on a model that proved wrong, and she described what the corrected model would have looked like. Tully looked at her for a moment. "Would you make the same call again with the same information?" "Yes," she said. "With the information I had at that point, the prioritization was defensible. With different information, I would make a different call. That's the difference between a bad decision and a decision that produced a bad outcome, and I need to be honest about which one this was." Tully wrote something. "Fair," he said, and moved on. Rourke, standing at Mara's left through the debrief, said nothing. He also didn't move away. The full assessment scores were compiled and presented by Hartwick at 17:30 in the same briefing room where the program had begun. The unit assembled with the mixed exhaustion and alertness of people who had spent 10 hours being evaluated and were now waiting to hear what the evaluation said. Mara sat in the first row. The scores were presented in full by component with aggregate rankings. She ranked second overall, behind Rourke, who had a combined score that reflected genuine exceptional performance across all components, which she respected without complicated feeling because it was accurate. She ranked first in the medical component by a meaningful margin. Her cross-functional integration score had improved through the afternoon scenario compared to the morning component, which Tully's evaluation noted as a specific positive indicator rather than simply a ranking. When Hartwick finished the presentation, she looked at the room. Cohort 7 completes today, she said. Assignment recommendations will go to command within 72 hours. I don't predict for the command process, but I will say that this cohort's performance overall, and in particular the performance demonstrated in an actual incident earlier this week rather than a simulated one, has produced a record I'll be citing in future program development conversations. She paused. Dismissed. The room broke. People stood, talked. The particular social release of a long evaluation finally concluded, moving through the space in visible waves. Greer appeared beside her. She turned. He looked like a man who had spent the day carrying something and had arrived at the point where he needed to set it down, and the question was just exactly how. I heard some of what's happening, he said, with Price, with how the concerns were built. He stopped. I want you to know that I filed them because I made a judgment about you that was wrong, not because someone told me to. That's on me. I know, she said, but someone used it. Yes. He looked uncomfortable in a way she thought was genuine and appropriate. Does that change it for you? She thought about it honestly. It tells me more about the situation than it changes how I see what you did, she said. What you did was wrong. What Price did was different. Both things can be true. He nodded slowly. It wasn't absolution, and she hadn't offered it as absolution, and she thought he understood the distinction, and the understanding of it was probably more useful to him than absolution would have been. He walked away. Rourke came to stand beside her in the space Greer had left, and this time he didn't preface anything with a tactical segue or a schedule reference. He just stood there for a moment in the way of someone who had something to say and was taking the time to make sure it was the right thing. Second overall, he said. You ran a better course, she said. On the tactical side, he looked at her. The medical lead role in the scenario. Tully flagged it to me separately, said the coordination under the communications degradation was the best he'd seen in that format. She received this without performing modesty and without overclaiming it. It was hard, she said. The triage call in the middle phase was wrong in a way I need to work on. You named it yourself in the debrief. That doesn't make it not wrong. No, he said. It makes you someone who can be trusted on the next call. He paused. Assignment recommendations go to command in 72 hours. I heard. I'm putting a recommendation in for the medical lead role in Bravo's next integrated cycle, he said, formally through the program office. You should know that. She looked at him directly. Why are you telling me in advance? Because you deserve to know what's coming instead of being surprised by it, he said. Like you should have been told a lot of things instead of being surprised by them. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in the directness of him that she had come to recognize as simply how he was built. No performance of confidence, no management of impression, just the thing itself. She respected it, and she was also, in some specific and honest way, moved by it, which she noted and did not perform. Thank you, she said. She meant it for more than the recommendation, and she thought he understood that because he nodded once in the way of someone receiving something they've actually heard rather than just processed. She was turning toward the door when her radio crackled. Not the compound frequency, but the secure channel Thorne's office had given her. She stepped into the corridor and answered. It was Dahl. Price was taken into custody at Regional Command at 1340, Dahl said. She's cooperating. We've been in debrief with her team for the past 4 hours. A pause. She named a fourth node in the network, someone we hadn't identified. Mara waited. It's not internal to Hargrove, Boss, Dahl said. It's in the medical integration program itself. Not the compound program, the national program. Someone at the administrative level who has been influencing assignment decisions across multiple cohorts. The implications expanded fast. Not one compromised compound, a compromised selection process affecting which personnel ended up in which assignments across the entire integrated program. The supply chain operation had been using personnel placement as one of its tools, putting the right people in the right positions, keeping certain types of people out. Who? Mara said. A program administrator named Whitfield, Dahl said, based out of the National Program Office. He's been managing cohort rosters for 11 years. 11 years? How many cohorts? She said. We're still working that, Dahl said. It's bigger than we thought, significantly. Mara stood in the corridor with the radio in her hand and the sound of the unit moving behind her through the briefing room door, and thought about how long 11 years was, and how many assignments, and how many people, and what it meant that a single node at the administrative level of a program could shape the entire field of who was where, and what she was standing inside of right now was not the end of anything. Thorne wants a full debrief tomorrow morning, Dahl said. 700, same location. I'll be there, Mara said. She lowered the radio and stood in the corridor, and the compound moved around her in its ordinary rhythms. People walking, vehicles crossing the motor pool, the PA system announcing evening meal hours, and the tone of a day that had decided to be a normal day, regardless of what it had actually contained. She thought about Whitfield. 11 years. Cohort rosters. The particular leverage point of deciding, at the administrative level, who the program considered qualified, who got reviewed, who got flagged. She thought about her own assignment, how it had come through, who had processed it, whether the selection board that had reviewed her credentials had done so inside a process that Whitfield had been shaping. And then she thought about something else, something that had been sitting in the periphery of her thinking since the debrief this morning and hadn't fully surfaced until this moment. She had been assigned to Cohort 7. Cohort 7 had been selected 3 months ago. Price had moved against her documentation within 10 days of her arrival, faster than normal bureaucratic machinery would typically generate a formal concern process. Much faster. Almost as if the concern process had been prepared in advance and was waiting for a trigger. She pulled up the program assignment notification she had received 3 months ago, still saved on her secure device because she kept everything. She looked at the processing codes at the bottom of the notification, the administrative trail that showed which office had touched the document in what sequence. The second processing code in the chain was a code she hadn't looked at when she'd first received the notification because it had appeared routine. It appeared routine because she hadn't known, 3 months ago, what to look for. She knew now. The code corresponded to Whitfield's program office. He had processed her assignment. He had known she was coming to Hargrove 3 months before she arrived, and Price had been ready. She looked at the code on her screen for a long time, and then she took a photograph of it and sent it to Dahl with 3 words. Check the assignment chain. The response came back in 4 minutes, already flagged. Stand by. She put the device in her pocket and stood in the corridor outside the briefing room where the people she had spent 8 weeks with were having the ordinary human moment of a hard evaluation ending, and she understood that what she was standing at the edge of was not a compound-level supply chain investigation. It was something with a national footprint and 11 years of roots, and it had tried to remove her before she'd even had the chance to understand what she was walking into, and it had failed, and now she was the person inside it who had seen enough of its structure to understand what needed to happen next. Her radio crackled again. Dahl's voice, different now, compressed, the tone of someone relaying something that had just changed the shape of everything. Whitfield is gone, Dahl said. His office cleared out. He was flagged an hour ago when we pulled the assignment chains, but someone got to him before we could move. He had a head start. A pause. He knew we were coming, Voss. Someone told him. She processed this. Someone inside the investigation had told Whitfield he was burned, which meant the network had a node she hadn't been told about, which meant Thorne's office had a leak, which meant the perimeter of this thing was further out than anyone had drawn it. How long of a head start? She said. Best estimate, 3 to 4 hours, Dahl said. We have people moving, but... She stopped. There's something else. We pulled his travel records. He booked a flight out of Callaway Regional this morning. Early departure. The flight's destination is... The radio cut out. Not signal degradation. Something else. A specific kind of silence that wasn't absence but interference. The silence of a communication channel that had been interrupted rather than dropped. She held the radio and the silence continued, and she understood that the silence was its own kind of message. And the message was that something in the next few hours was going to require her to make decisions without the full picture, the way it always did in the moments that actually counted, and the question was whether she was going to be ready. She was still looking at the radio when the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Reyes came through it at a pace that was not quite a run, but was everything short of one. And his face told her before he reached her that whatever he was about to say had changed again. "We found Whitfield," he said. "Where?" she said. "He didn't get on this flight," Reyes said. He stopped in front of her. "He's still on compound, Voss. We have a confirmed sighting from gate security 40 minutes ago." He held her gaze. "He came back, and we don't know why." "Where on compound?" Mara said. "Medical building," Reyes said. "East wing." Gate security picked him up on camera 6 minutes ago, entering through the staff access point on the south side. He used a credential that should have been deactivated when we flagged him. He was already moving back toward the door he'd come through. The credential belonged to someone else. "We're still identifying who." She was moving with him before he finished the sentence. The East Medical Building was 4 minutes away at a walk. They covered it in 90 seconds, and as they moved, Reyes was on his radio relaying positions and requesting compound security convergence on the East Wing without a lockdown announcement, because a lockdown announcement would tell Whitfield he was cornered before they had people in place, and a cornered man who had already demonstrated he was willing to run was a different problem from a man who thought he still had options. "Vance," Mara said. Reyes glanced at her. "Whitfield came back to the medical building," she said. "Vance is in the recovery ward. Vance is the person who can testify that Cass warned him away from Building 7 the day before the incident. Vance is a thread that connects Cass to advanced knowledge of the operation." She kept her pace. "Whitfield didn't come back for equipment. He came back to close a thread." Reyes got on his radio immediately, voice dropping into the clipped economy of someone redirecting resources under time pressure. She heard him request security personnel to the recovery ward specifically, priority movement. And she heard the acknowledgement come back with a timeline that was not fast enough. She broke into a full run. The south entrance of the East Medical Building was 40 meters ahead, and the corridor inside would take her straight through to the recovery ward if she cut through the supply annex, which saved 40 seconds over the main corridor route. She knew the layout because she had been working in this building for a week, and she had, as a matter of ingrained habit, learned the layout of every building she worked in to the point where she could navigate it without light. She went through the south entrance and turned left into the supply annex and ran. The annex connected to the main medical corridor through a set of double doors that she hit at speed, and beyond the double doors the corridor was empty for the first 15 meters. And then it wasn't. A figure moving fast toward the recovery ward entrance, civilian clothes under a white coat that hadn't been there when the gate camera picked him up, which meant he'd obtained it inside the building, which meant he'd been planning this layer of cover before he came back through the gate. "Stop," she said, her voice carried in the corridor with the particular authority of someone who has said the word in enough situations that it carries the weight of all of them. The figure stopped. He turned. Whitfield was not what she had pictured, which she noted without surprise because people rarely were. He was in his late 50s, slightly built, with the face of someone who spent his professional life behind a desk, managing things that other people did in the field, soft around the edges in the physical sense, sharp in the eyes in the way of people who were accustomed to operating through mechanisms rather than directly. He looked at her, and she saw the calculation happen. Who she was, what she represented, how much time he had before the calculation stopped mattering. "You're Voss," he said. "Step away from the ward door," she said. He didn't move toward the door. He also didn't step away from it. He stood in the corridor with the white coat and the expired credential and the face of a man doing arithmetic on options that were diminishing fast, and he said something she hadn't expected. "I didn't know about Building 7, he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever Price and Cass were running at the operational level, I moved paper. I managed assignments. I didn't know it would get to this." "That's a conversation for an investigator," she said. "Step away from the door." "I need you to understand." "I don't need to understand anything from you right now," she said. "I need you to step away from that door, put your hands where I can see them, and wait for the people who are 30 seconds behind me. That's the entire conversation we're having in this corridor." Something in him deflated. Not dramatically. People didn't deflate dramatically in real corridors. They did it in the small, incremental way of pressure, leaving a system that has been holding too much for too long. He took 2 steps away from the recovery ward door. His hands came up to shoulder height. Reyes came through the double doors behind her with 2 compound security officers. and the corridor filled with the organized, practiced efficiency of people taking control of a situation that had been about to go somewhere irreversible and hadn't. She stepped back and let them work. She stood in the corridor with her back against the wall while they processed Whitfield with the professionalism of people doing a job, and she looked at the recovery ward door and thought about Vance on the other side of it, and the 40 seconds it might have been if she hadn't known the layout of the supply annex. And she felt the adrenaline in her system doing its slow, reliable work of finding the exit now that the immediate requirement for it was gone. Her hands were steady. They had been steady throughout. She noted this not with pride, but with the calm recognition of someone who had trained a long time for her body to behave a specific way under specific conditions, and whose body, to its credit, generally did. Reyes appeared beside her after the security team had moved Whitfield toward the building exit. "Good call on Vance," he said. "It was the logical target," she said. "Most people don't run the logic that fast under that condition," he said. She looked at him. "Most people haven't spent as long as I have learning to," she said. It wasn't a boast, it was just accurate, and she had stopped being uncomfortable with accurate assessments of herself somewhere around the same time she'd stopped letting other people's inaccurate ones define her. He nodded. "Thorne's going to want a full brief tonight." "I know," she said. "How's Vance?" Reyes glanced toward the ward door. "Secure." Night staff was with him throughout. Whitfield didn't get within 20 feet of the room. She exhaled slowly. "Go check on him yourself," Reyes said. "I'll handle the initial paperwork on the corridor incident. Thorne can wait 2 hours." She looked at him with faint surprise. "You've been running since 0400, he said simply. "Go do the thing that's actually in your lane and let me do the administrative part. That's a reasonable division of labor." She went through the recovery ward door. Vance was awake. He was also considerably more alert than he had been at 0430, which the pleural effusion treatment and a full day of recovery had apparently contributed to, and he looked at her when she came in with the expression of someone who had been piecing together the day's events from fragments and was not entirely sure what the assembled picture meant. "You're the one who was here this morning," he said. His voice was rough but functional. "Yes," she said. She pulled the chair to his bedside and sat down because she was, in the specific and concrete way of someone who had been on their feet since before dawn, very tired. "They told me someone tried to get in here tonight," he said. "They handled it," she said. "You're fine." He looked at her for a moment with the particular searching attention of someone deciding how much to ask. "Cass warned me away from that building," he said. "I told you that this morning." "I know. That information is with people who needed it. Did it help?" "Yes," she said. "It helped." He absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling in the way of someone working through something that had been sitting unexamined for too long. "I didn't report it when he told me," Vance said. "I thought he was just, I don't know, being weird. There was no context for it. I just didn't go to Building 7 the next day because Cass had a thing about following whatever Cass said and—" He stopped. "If I'd reported it." "You didn't know what it meant," she said. "You can't report what you don't understand." "I could have been curious enough to ask questions." "Yes," she said. "You could have been. So could a lot of people who weren't." She looked at him directly. "That's something to carry forward, not something to build a case against yourself with." He looked at her. "You're pretty direct." "I've been told," she said. Something in his face shifted toward what might, in a few days when the pain was less and the situation was further away, become the early version of a smile. "Rourke talks about you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Not like he mentioned you to the unit when the assessment was happening today." Vance shifted slightly against his pillow. "He said something like that the program was built around the idea of finding people who performed when it actually mattered, and that some people spent entire careers looking like they performed, and one real situation was enough to show the difference." He paused. "He didn't use your name, but everyone knew who he meant." She sat with that for a moment. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have 2 more weeks of recovery, and they go faster when you're not awake for all of them." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was not something she'd been called before, and which landed unexpectedly with a kind of warmth she didn't perform a reaction to and didn't dismiss either. She left the ward and stood in the corridor outside and let herself be tired for exactly as long as she needed to be, which turned out to be about 4 minutes. And then she went to find somewhere to sit and write up the corridor incident before the details softened at the edges, the way everything did when the adrenaline was fully gone. The debrief with Thorne happened the following morning, and it ran 3 hours. And by the end of it, the shape of the operation had been fully articulated for the first time in a single room. Whitfield had spent the night in compound security custody and had begun cooperating within 2 hours of his detention, which Thorne's team attributed to the particular psychology of men who had operated through mechanisms for so long that they had no practiced framework for direct confrontation with consequences. He had named his contact inside Thorne's office, a junior analyst named Farr, who had been feeding the network timeline information for 7 months. And the scope of the assignment manipulation had been mapped across 6 years of cohort rosters, not 11. The 11-year number had been a preliminary estimate based on Whitfield's tenure. The actual operational period was 6 years, which was still large enough to implicate dozens of assignments across multiple integrated programs. The supply chain operation itself was financial at its core, classified material being redirected through a series of logistics subcontractors, the financial benefits flowing to a small network of individuals across military and civilian sectors. The personnel manipulation had been the maintenance layer, keeping people out of assignments where they might notice, and keeping certain people in assignments where they wouldn't. Mara had been flagged 18 months ago, before her integration program assignment, when her background clearance had come up. In a cross-reference, the network ran periodically on personnel who might end up in positions of relevance. The assignment to Cohort 7 had been processed through Whitfield's office and had triggered the price contingency, a prepared response to the presence of personnel whose background represented investigative risk. They had tried to remove her before she could become a problem. They had, in doing so, created exactly the chain of events that became their undoing. Thorne laid this out in the debrief with the same unornamented precision he applied to everything, and Mara sat across from him and listened to the shape of the past 3 weeks described from the outside, from the perspective of an investigation that had been running parallel to everything she had lived through it, and found the experience of hearing it more disorienting than she had expected. It was one thing to be inside a situation and respond to it. It was another to hear that situation described as a sequence of deliberate actions taken against you by people who had studied your file and decided you were a threat before you had any awareness of their existence. "You're going to be a witness in federal proceedings," Thorne said when the operational overview was done. "Price, Cass, Whitfield, and the logistics chain. Your statement record, the Building 7 incident report, the corridor incident last night, all of it becomes evidentiary." "I know," she said. "It will take time. These processes take time." "I know that too," she said. Thorne looked at her for a moment. The same look he'd given her through the screen the morning before, the one that was assessing something other than her operational utility. "How are you doing?" he said. The question was simple enough that it caught her slightly off guard, which told her something about how she'd been operating. So focused on what was in front of her that the question of how she was actually doing had been deferred to a later date that kept not arriving. "I'll sort that out when there's space for it," she said. "Make space for it," he said. "That's a recommendation, not an order. The people who don't tend to present problems later that were avoidable." She nodded. "The integration program assignment recommendation has been formally submitted," he said. "From Hartwick's office. Your assessment scores, your conduct through the Building 7 incident and the investigation, and Rourke's recommendation for the medical lead role in Bravo's next cycle. It goes to command for final approval, but Hartwick's recommendations move." She looked at him. "Did your office weigh in on it?" "We cleared the path," he said. "The recommendation is the program's. The recognition is yours." He paused. "Those are different things, and I want you to be clear on the difference." She was. She had thought about this, about whether what was coming would be contaminated by the circumstances that had produced it, whether the recognition would feel borrowed from the investigation rather than earned from the work. She had thought about it at 0400 in the medical building corridor, and she had thought about it in Vance's recovery room, and she had come to the same place both times. She had done the work. The investigation had removed the obstacles to the work being seen. Those were two separate facts, and the second didn't diminish the first. The obstacles had been real, and removing them had required something, and what it had required had been hers to give. That was the full picture. "I'm clear," she said. The formal proceedings happened 6 weeks later, which was faster than federal military proceedings typically moved and which Thorne's office attributed to the cooperation level of the detained parties and the completeness of the documentary record. Price entered a cooperation agreement that included full disclosure of the network's operational history in exchange for a sentencing reduction that still carried significant prison time and permanent revocation of her military credentials and clearances. The agreement required her to testify against the civilian nodes of the supply chain operation, which she did, and her testimony was corroborated by Cass's separate cooperation and Whitfield's detailed account of the assignment manipulation process. Cass received a reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation and his disclosure of the Building 7 timeline. The disclosure that had, by Thorne's assessment, been the thread that unraveled the operational picture fast enough to prevent Whitfield's disappearance from becoming permanent. The judge in his proceeding noted on record that his decision to warn Vance away from the building, while legally insufficient to excuse his participation in the broader operation, had been the action of someone who had not been entirely lost, and whose cooperation had prevented further harm. Mara sat in the proceedings as a witness and testified on 3 separate dates about 3 separate aspects of the operational timeline. She was precise, complete, and without editorializing, which the presiding judge noted at the conclusion of her 3rd testimony as exemplary witness conduct. She did not find the courtroom process satisfying in the way that narrative resolution was supposed to feel satisfying. She found it necessary, which was different and more honest. Whitfield received the longest sentence of the group. His cooperation had been useful but late. His manipulation of the assignment process had been the most sustained component of the operation. And the presiding judge was particularly detailed in articulating the specific harm caused by an administrator who used his position to systematically shape which personnel could and couldn't be effective in their roles. The particular quiet violence of institutional gatekeeping in service of criminal protection. Farr, the analyst inside Thorne's office, was processed separately through a different channel, and Mara was not a party to those proceedings. She received a brief communication from Thorne's office telling her the matter had been resolved and that the security review of his office's operation had been completed. She noted the outcome and moved forward. Greer submitted his formal retraction to Hartwick's program office 17 days after the assessment, on his own initiative and without prompting from any investigative process. The document was precise and without excuse-making. He stated that the concerns he had filed had been based on personal bias, that had been operationalized by parties with a separate agenda, that his participation in the concern process had been wrong regardless of how it had been used, and that he was formally requesting the retraction be placed in the program record alongside the original filing so that the full history was visible rather than simply corrected by erasure. Hartwick approved the request and told Mara about it in a brief meeting that lasted 8 minutes and covered several other administrative items before she mentioned Greer's submission at the end. Mara received the information without large reaction, because the reaction she had was not one she needed to perform in Hartwick's office. She felt something shift in the accounting of the past 2 months. Not completion exactly, because these things didn't complete cleanly, but a settling. The acknowledgement of wrong as wrong, on record, by the person who had done it. That had its own weight, and she gave it the weight it deserved. "He's a better operator than he was when you arrived," Hartwick said. "That matters for what he does next." "People are allowed to learn," Mara said. Hartwick looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from the colonel before, something that acknowledged more than the specific conversation they were having. "Yes," she said. "They are." Vance's recovery took 3 weeks instead of 2, which he attributed to the setback of the pleural effusion, and the medical staff attributed to his insistence on pushing the physical recovery timeline faster than the surgical timeline supported. Mara visited him twice during that period, not as his treating nurse because she was not assigned to the recovery ward after her reinstatement to the integration program, but as someone who had sat on the floor next to him in a lobby and had a right to check in. On the second visit, a week before his discharge, he was sitting up and had the look of someone whose body was finally tracking with what his mind had been attempting for the past 2 weeks. "They told me what Whitfield was trying to do," he said, "when he came back." "Yes," she said, "and you got there first." "I ran faster," she said. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had spent weeks in a recovery bed with nothing to do but think. "Why did you come back?" he said. to the program. After everything that happened with the documentation concerns, you could have filed a complaint, requested a different assignment, done any number of things that didn't involve walking back into a unit that had tried to push you out. She thought about how to answer honestly. Because walking away would have meant they were right, she said. Not about my qualifications, about the idea that this space wasn't for me. She paused. I spent years doing work that I was very good at in environments where I couldn't talk about it. I came here because I wanted to do work that I was good at and have it be visible. Walking away would have been handing the invisibility back to the people who wanted to make me invisible. Vance was quiet for a moment. That makes sense, he said. It also meant I was still here when you needed someone with a trauma bag, she said, which was less philosophical. He laughed, which cost him something based on the brief expression that crossed his face, and then he laughed again anyway, which told her most of what she needed to know about how his recovery was actually progressing. The formal recognition ceremony was held at Hargrove 41 days after the Building 7 incident, in the main assembly hall, before a room that held Colonel Hartwick, the integration program staff, the full Cohort 7 unit, base command, a delegation from Thorne's office that included Thorne himself, and a significant number of personnel from across the compound who had heard enough fragments of what had happened to want to be present for the full account. Mara had been told about the ceremony 72 hours in advance, which was enough time to have opinions about it, but not enough time to do much with the opinions. She had spent most of those 72 hours preparing for the first full week of her official assignment to Bravo Element's medical lead role, which had been finalized by Command 3 weeks earlier and which was the thing that actually occupied most of her thinking. The ceremony was for other people's understanding. The work was hers. She stood in her dress uniform in the assembly hall and listened to the formal account of the Building 7 incident delivered by a general she hadn't previously met, who read from a prepared document with the measured cadence of official recognition and then departed from it at the end in a way that felt specific and genuine rather than prepared. The recommendations submitted for this recognition cited something that I want to read directly, the general said, because I think it's the most accurate sentence I've encountered in a decade of reading these documents. He looked down at the page. Quote, "The program was built to find people who perform when it actually matters. This is what that looks like." Rourke had written the recommendation. She had known that, but hearing the sentence read aloud in a room of this size landed differently than reading it in a document. She received it in the same way she had received everything in the past 6 weeks, without performing a reaction, but also without discarding the actual reaction underneath. What she felt was not triumph. She wanted to be precise about this because triumph was the wrong shape for it. What she felt was closer to the particular satisfaction of something having been true the entire time finally being acknowledged as true, not made true, not proven true in the legal sense, but recognized. The distinction mattered to her. She had been exactly what she was before anyone confirmed it. The confirmation changed other people's understanding, not the underlying fact. She received the recognition, shook the general's hand, and turned to face the room. The operators who had laughed on the first day were in the front row, and she looked at them directly and without performance because they deserved to be seen seeing her, and because the moment was large enough to hold the complexity of what it meant for all of them to be in the same room with the truth finally visible. Greer was on the left end of the front row. He met her eyes and held them and nodded once with the particular gravity of someone who had done a hard thing and wasn't asking for credit for doing it. She nodded back. Rourke, beside him, had the expression of a man who had seen what he'd expected to see and was at peace with the fact that his expectation had been correct. Nothing more complicated than that. Which was, she thought, one of the things she most respected about him. The reception afterward was the kind of event that she was not naturally suited to. A room full of people who wanted to speak to her about what had happened, each of them carrying a slightly different version of the story shaped by what they'd seen or been told or inferred, and her role in the conversation being to receive all of those versions with patience and without correcting the ones that were only slightly wrong. She managed it for 90 minutes, which she thought was reasonable. And then she stepped out through a side door into the corridor and stood alone for a moment in the quiet. Thorne found her there. He came through the same door 2 minutes later and stood beside her against the wall with the comfortable silence of a man who had been in enough corridors to know that corridors were where the real conversations happened. "The witness proceedings are complete," he said. Sentencing finalizes next month for the remaining parties. Your formal involvement is done. I know, she said. My office is going to have questions for you over the next year as the broader supply chain operation finishes being mapped, he said. Nothing that will pull you out of your assignment. Consultation, not involvement. That's fine, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to ask you something and you can answer or not. Okay, she said. When you read that letter from my office on your bunk 3 weeks ago, he said, and understood that the world you'd left was reaching back for you, what did you decide? She thought about it honestly. She remembered the bunk, the single page, the particular weight of the seal. I decided that the reach didn't have to become a return, she said, that I could give what was needed without giving back the whole thing. She paused. I decided I was going to stay exactly where I was. Thorne looked at her for a moment with something that was, she thought, as close to approval as he allowed himself in professional contexts. Good decision, he said. He went back through the side door. She stayed in the corridor for a few more minutes, listening to the sound of the reception through the wall, the particular low-grade hum of a large room full of people talking, the kind of sound that was most often associated with ordinary life and which she had, over the past 3 weeks, found herself actively seeking out rather than treating as background. Reyes appeared at the far end of the corridor, heading somewhere with the purposeful pace of someone who had a next thing to get to, and he saw her and stopped. Going back in? He said. In a minute, she said. He nodded. He was almost past her when he stopped again and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I've been on a lot of these operations. The part where someone holds a wound closed with one hand and neutralizes a threat with the other and then goes straight back to the wound. I've seen the footage a few times now, and it still doesn't look real. It felt real, she said. That's what I mean, he said, and kept walking. She stood alone in the corridor and thought about that, about what it felt like from the inside versus what it looked like from the outside, and how the gap between those two things was where most misunderstandings lived. From the inside, she had been doing what she was trained to do in the only way she knew how to do it, which was completely and without reservation, because reservation in that moment was a form of failure she wasn't willing to accept. From the outside, apparently, it looked like something that didn't seem real. She thought about that gap a lot in the weeks that followed. In the early mornings on the track, in the medical lead briefings with Bravo Element, where she was building the working relationship that would define the next phase of her professional life. In the quiet late evenings in her quarters when the day's work was done and there was space for the thinking she had deferred through most of the past month. She thought about the people who had looked at her on day one and seen a problem. She thought about the machinery that had been built to remove her before she could become what she already was. She thought about Whitfield managing assignment rosters for 6 years, shaping the field of who got to be where. And she thought about how many people had been moved out of rooms they belonged in by processes that looked procedural and were something else entirely. She thought about what it cost to stay. Not in the abstract, in the specific, concrete sense of what the past 3 weeks had taken from her in sleep and in steadiness, and in the particular kind of trust that gets worn down when the institutions around you turn out to be operating at cross purposes to their stated function. It had cost something real. She was not going to pretend it hadn't, because pretending things didn't cost what they cost was how people ended up paying the same price twice without understanding why. But she was still here. That was the fact that organized everything else. She had stayed, and the staying had meant she was present for the moments that needed her to be present, and the moments had happened the way they needed to happen. And the people who had tried to write the ending for her had found instead that they were characters in a story she was still writing herself. She went back into the reception. Rourke was near the door talking to 2 of the Bravo Element operators about something she couldn't hear from where she entered. He saw her come in, and something in his expression settled. The particular settling of someone who has been tracking whether a thing would happen and has just confirmed that it has. She crossed the room to where he was standing. Medical lid brief is at 700 tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. The knee is fine, she said. It's not fine, he said. But you'll manage. That's the deal, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the directness that was simply how he was and that she had come to find over the weeks one of the most honest things about him. For what it's worth, he said, what happened in this program, the full sequence of it, I'm glad it happened the way it did. She raised an eyebrow. Not the parts that were wrong, he said. Those were wrong and they'll be wrong in hindsight too. But the way it ended, the sequence that led here, he paused. Some things need to be seen clearly before they can be understood. This unit needed to see clearly. She thought about that. So did some other people, she said. He nodded once, knowing she meant herself as much as anyone else, and not pushing past that acknowledgement because it was complete. There was a version of this story, she thought, where the people who underestimated her were simply wrong, and she was simply right, and the ending was clean and uncomplicated. She had been offered that version, and she had noticed how much it wanted to flatten everything into a single note. The real version was messier. She had made a misjudgment about her own documentation risk. She had read Cass as conflicted when he was complicit. She had needed Rourke to come to the break room and tell her what he'd learned because she hadn't been able to see the full picture from inside it. She had been tired, and she had been wrong sometimes. And she had held a wound closed with shaking hands on a lobby floor in a building she hadn't been authorized to enter, and the shaking had been real even if it hadn't slowed her down. That was the actual story. Not the version where she was unassailable, the version where she was a specific person with specific capabilities and specific limits who had done specific things in a specific sequence and had stayed present for all of it. That was the version worth telling. Not because it was inspiring in the clean, comfortable sense of the word, but because it was true. And truth had a weight that comfort didn't. She had been seen as nothing. She had stayed anyway. She had done the work anyway. And the work had spoken in a room where words hadn't been enough. And it had kept speaking past every mechanism that had been built to silence it. And in the end, it had been louder than anything that had tried to replace it. She stood in the assembly hall of Hargrove Veterans Combat Medical Center, and the room moved around her in its ordinary living way, and she thought about what came next. Not as a destination, but as the simple, daily continuation of doing what she knew how to do in the place where she had finally, at considerable cost and without apology, chosen to be. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.